Montana wilderness stretched below her like a frozen ocean. Dawn painted the ridgeline in shades of copper and ash. Cara Flynn lay prone on granite, still cold from the night, her breath visible in the thin mountain air, her rifle an extension of muscle memory carved into bone over 10,000 repetitions. 800 meters downslope, the compound looked like something from a documentary about survivalists. Chain link fence topped with concertina wire, prefab buildings arranged in defensive semicircle, pickup trucks parked nose out for quick departure, American flags snapping in wind that carried the smell of pine and diesel, and something else. Something that smelled like men preparing for war they believed inevitable. Flynn's scope tracked movement in the compound yard. 20 figures, maybe 25. Most carrying rifles with the casual familiarity of people who had carried rifles in places where hesitation measured the difference between breathing and bleeding out in sand that didn't care about your politics or your principles or the people waiting for you to come home. Her radio crackled. A woman's voice, professional and cold as the granite beneath Flynn's elbows. Cara Flynn, you are surrounded. This is FBI Special Agent Victoria Shelton. You have 60 seconds to exit the compound with hands visible, or we execute breach protocol. This is your only warning. Flynn's finger rested outside the trigger guard. Discipline. The kind that came from instructors who would rather you failed than develop bad habits that would kill you later when the stakes were measured in American lives instead of training scores. She whispered into the wind, knowing no one could hear her except maybe God, if he paid attention to the prayers of women who had survived when better people hadn't. 6 went in, 1 came out. Hale said 0 necessary kills. Time to prove him right. Then she was moving. Fluid. Silent. Disappearing into tree line before the compound woke to sirens and spotlights and the organized chaos of federal agents who believed they were hunting domestic terrorists but had no idea they were actually hunting a ghost who had been officially dead for 2 years and 3 months and 17 days. 48 hours earlier, the compound had been quieter. Flynn moved through the mess hall carrying a tray that held coffee too weak and eggs too hard. Her name here was Morgan Cade, former construction worker from Boise. Father killed in Fallujah back when Fallujah was a name that appeared on evening news instead of history textbooks. A woman who wanted nothing more than to be left alone by a government that couldn't leave anyone alone. It was a good cover, simple, backed by documentation that would hold up to everything except the kind of scrutiny that involved fingerprint analysis or deep background checks. The kind of scrutiny that federal agents deployed when they suspected someone was more than they appeared. Flynn had been Morgan Cade for 10 months, 304 days of keeping her head down and her skills hidden, of talking just enough to seem normal but not so much that anyone remembered specific details, of being exactly unremarkable in a compound full of people trying very hard to be remarkable. The Forgotten Veterans Coalition occupied 200 acres of Montana wilderness, purchased with pooled disability payments in severance bonuses and the kind of group funding that happened when people stopped trusting institutions and started trusting each other. 200 members, give or take. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans mostly. Men and women who had done what their country asked and came home to discover their country had moved on to other concerns and other wars and other people to use up and forget. They weren't white supremacists, weren't planning to overthrow anything. They just wanted to be ready for the day the government decided veterans who knew how to fight were too dangerous to leave armed and angry and organized. Flynn understood the impulse. She had felt it herself in the months after Syria, after the classified debriefing that involved more lawyers than intelligence officers, after the memorial service for people whose families were told they died in training accidents, instead of betrayals that went high enough to require presidential-level classification. She sat at a corner table, alone. That was part of the cover, too. Loners didn't attract questions. They attracted theories and speculation and eventually acceptance that some people just preferred their own company. Across the mess hall, Colonel Marcus Brennan held court with the senior members. At 58, Brennan moved like time had tried to slow him down and failed. His hair had gone silver, but his shoulders remained squared by decades of command. His eyes carried the specific weight of men who had given orders that resulted in body bags and learned to sleep anyway because the mission required it. Brennan had been Marine infantry, 3 tours Iraq, 2 Afghanistan, decorated, respected, the kind of leader who could have made general if he had been willing to play politics instead of insisting on principles. He had chosen principles. The Marine Corps had chosen politics. So Brennan retired and founded the coalition and waited for the day his suspicions about government overreach proved justified. Flynn watched him the way a sniper watches terrain, looking for patterns, weaknesses. The moment when attention shifted and opportunity opened. She had been watching for 10 months, waiting for him to make a mistake. He hadn't. Breakfast ended. Members dispersed to work details. The coalition ran like a military base because most of the people running it had military experience and military solutions to civilian problems. Guard rotations, equipment maintenance, training schedules, everything documented and organized in exactly the kind of structure that made infiltration difficult and exposure catastrophic. Flynn carried her tray to the kitchen, rinsed her plate, moved through routines that had become automatic. Invisible actions performed by invisible people in a world that only noticed you when you wanted to be noticed, or when you made mistakes that drew attention you couldn't afford. She was halfway to the armory for her equipment check when Brennan's voice stopped her. "Morgan, got a minute?" Flynn turned, kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." Brennan gestured toward the maintenance shed. Private, away from ears that might repeat conversations to people who might ask questions. Flynn followed, cataloging exits and improvised weapons, and the 17 ways she could neutralize Brennan if this conversation went wrong. She hoped it wouldn't. Killing him would compromise the mission. And the mission mattered more than any individual life. That was what Hale had taught her, what Syria had proven. Inside the shed, Brennan closed the door. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the walls, painting everything in stripes of gold and shadow. The air smelled like gun oil and sawdust, and the particular scent of men who worked with their hands because working with their hands kept them sane. Brennan pulled a rifle from the rack. M11 semi-automatic sniper system. Standard issue for Marine Scout snipers until budget cuts and doctrine changes replaced it with newer platforms that weren't necessarily better, just different. He handed it to Flynn. "Strip it." Flynn took the weapon, felt the weight, the balance. Muscle memory activated before conscious thought. Her hands moved through the disassembly sequence. Magazine out, bolt back, chamber check. Takedown pins, upper and lower receiver separation. Bolt carrier group extraction. Gas system. Barrel, each component placed on the workbench in order that would allow reassembly in darkness or under fire, or in the kind of conditions where hesitation costs seconds that cost lives. 43 seconds. She could have done it in 35, but Morgan Cade wouldn't have trained to championship speed. Morgan Cade would have learned from YouTube videos and a father who died before he could teach her everything. Brennan watched. His eyes tracked her hands with the attention of someone looking for tells, for the small details that separated trained from self-taught, professional from amateur. Flynn kept her movements steady. Not too fast, not too precise. Good, but not perfect. Exactly what you would expect from someone who practiced alone in a basement because they had no one left to practice with. She finished, looked up, met Brennan's eyes. He was studying her face now instead of her hands. "You stripped that weapon like you've done it 10,000 times, Morgan. Where'd a construction worker from Idaho learn that kind of muscle memory?" Flynn's voice stayed level, even. The tone of someone telling a story they had told before and would tell again until everyone stopped asking. "YouTube, sir, and a dad who was Marine Artillery, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. He taught me what he could before Fallujah. I've been teaching myself ever since, keeping his memory alive." It was true. The foster father who raised her after the state took her from parents who couldn't stop using long enough to keep custody. The Marine who treated her like a daughter instead of a case file number. The man who died in Fallujah in 2006 when she was 12, and the world learned that grief had no statute of limitations. She had joined the Marines to honor him, had pushed herself through recruit training and infantry school and scout sniper course because he believed she could do anything if she wanted it badly enough. Had proven him right in every qualification and every deployment until Syria taught her that wanting something badly enough couldn't stop bullets or betrayals or the moment when someone you trusted sold you out for reasons you would spend years trying to understand. Brennan nodded slowly. Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like recognition. The look one veteran gave another when they spotted the invisible marks that service carved into people who survived it. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, he repeated. "Good unit. Your father would be proud of how you honor his training." Flynn said nothing. Sometimes the best response was silence. Let people fill gaps with their own assumptions, their own narratives, their own need to believe they understood you when understanding required context they would never have. Brennan gestured to the rifle parts. "Reassemble it, then meet me at the range. I want to see how you shoot." Flynn's pulse quickened. This was opportunity, or exposure, the line between them thinner than most people realized. She had avoided the range for 10 months, avoided any situation where her skills might reveal training that went beyond YouTube tutorials and a dead father's legacy. But refusing would raise different questions, worse questions. She reassembled the M110, smooth, efficient, not championship fast, but competent. The kind of competent that suggested natural aptitude rather than institutional instruction. 38 seconds. Brennan smiled. Range, 20 minutes. Then he was gone, leaving Flynn alone with a rifle and a decision that would determine whether the next 10 months of work ended in mission success or career-ending failure, or the third option that people in her profession didn't talk about, but everyone understood existed. The option where you didn't come back at all. Flynn returned the rifle to the rack, walked toward her quarters. Small room in the barracks building. Bunk, locker, window that overlooked the compound yard and the fence line and the tree line beyond, where FBI surveillance teams were probably already positioning for operations they believed justified, and Flynn knew would end in bloodshed if someone didn't find a way to thread a needle that kept getting smaller. She opened her locker. Beneath spare clothes and personal effects lay the equipment she had carried through 10 months of deep cover. Encrypted phone, backup identification, emergency extraction beacon, and the thing that mattered more than any of them, a photograph. 6 Marines in desert utilities standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. Syria, March 2019, 22 hours before the mission that killed 5 of them and sent the 6th into hiding that had lasted 2 years and counting. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Hell stood center. 55 years old, 33 years service. The kind of institutional knowledge that made him invaluable, and the kind of principles that made him dangerous to people who valued expediency over ethics. His hand rested on Flynn's shoulder in the photograph. Casual, paternal, the way fathers touched daughters they were proud of. Next to Hale stood Captain Ryan Brennan, 26, eager. The kind of officer who led from the front because that was what his father taught him, and what the Marine Corps expected, and what men who believed in honor did even when honor cost everything. Captain Luis Torres stood on Ryan's right, 28, logistics officer who understood supply chains and manifests, and the critical difference between authorized equipment transfers and the kind of transfers that ended up arming people who used them to kill Americans. 3 others filled out the team, their names carved into Flynn's memory alongside their service numbers and their final words in the specific way each of them died when the building collapsed and she was dragged away screaming, and Hale made the choice that saved her life and destroyed her soul. She touched Hale's face in the photograph, felt the grief that 2 years hadn't diminished, felt the weight of lessons he had taught in the months before Syria. Lessons about precision and discipline, and the question every sniper had to answer before pulling the trigger. Is this kill necessary? Hale believed most kills weren't. Believed competence gave you options that mediocrity never allowed. Believed the best snipers were the ones who could make impossible shots, but chose to take them only when every other option had been exhausted. Flynn had spent 2 years trying to live up to that philosophy. 2 years of missions where she neutralized targets without killing them, where she disabled vehicles instead of their drivers, where she found third options and fourth options and options that people said were impossible right up until the moment she proved them wrong. 0 necessary kills. It had become her operating principle, her tribute to Hale, her way of honoring the man who saved her life by destroying his mission parameters and accepting the court-martial that would have ended his career if the classified nature of the operation hadn't buried everything under classification levels that required presidential authorization to access. Hale had died 4 months after Syria. Heart attack. Officially. Flynn knew better, knew the kind of stress that came from carrying secrets heavy enough to crush men stronger than Hale. Knew he had been investigating something in the months before his death, something connected to Syria, something that got him classified as a security risk and isolated from the community he had served for 3 decades. His last message to Flynn had been cryptic. 3 words on encrypted channel. Montana, Brennan, Javelin. Flynn had spent 6 months decoding that message. 6 months of research and surveillance and careful investigation that led her to the Forgotten Veterans Coalition and to Colonel Marcus Brennan and to the basement of this compound where weapons were stored that shouldn't exist outside of classified military inventories. Javelin missiles, the same ones that had gone missing from the Syria depot her team raided 3 days before the ambush. The same ones that had been used against them when the building collapsed and 5 Marines died and Flynn survived, and someone very high up decided the best way to handle the scandal was to classify everything and everyone and pretend none of it ever happened. Flynn closed the locker, checked her watch. 15 minutes until range time. 15 minutes to decide how much skill to reveal and how much to hide, and where the line was between maintaining cover and compromising mission. She made her decision, walked toward the range, breathing steady, heart rate controlled, the way Hale taught her when dealing with stress that could cloud judgment and get you killed. The range occupied a natural bowl in the terrain, berms on 3 sides, targets at 50, 100, 300, 600 meters, wind flags every 100 meters, spotting scopes on tripods, Everything a serious shooter needed to train and nothing a serious shooter would find unusual. Brennan waited with three other coalition members. Derek Nash, 45, former Army infantry, the kind of paranoid that came from too many patrols, where the friendly local who waved yesterday planted the IED that killed your squad today. He watched Flynn with suspicion that never quite crossed into accusation, but never quite faded into acceptance either. Thomas Webb and Michael Cruz rounded out the group. Both Marines, both combat veterans, both carrying the invisible weight of people who had done things they couldn't talk about in places they couldn't name for reasons that still woke them up at 3 in the morning, wondering if any of it mattered. Brennan handed Flynn the M110, 600 meters, 5 rounds. Show me what YouTube taught you. Flynn accepted the weapon, moved to the firing line, dropped into prone position that felt like coming home, like muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, like the 1,000 repetitions that separated adequate from exceptional. She breathed, felt wind on her face, watched flags rippling at 12 degrees left to right, estimated speed at 8 miles per hour, adjusted her point of aim, 2 minutes of angle right to compensate, elevation already dialed for 600 meters. Her finger found the trigger. 2-stage, slack taken up on the first pressure, breakpoint waiting for the second. She fired. The target was a silhouette, center mass hit. Not perfect, not bullseye, but solid. The kind of shot that suggested competence without revealing expertise. 4 more rounds, 4 more hits, grouping spread across an 8-inch circle. Good shooting, the kind you would expect from someone who practiced regularly but wasn't a trained sniper. Flynn cleared the weapon, stood, handed it back to Brennan. His expression was unreadable. He studied the target through the spotting scope, studied Flynn's stance, her breathing, the small details that told stories to people who knew how to read them. Derek Nash spoke first. Decent shooting for a civilian. Where'd you qualify? Flynn kept her face neutral. Qualify? Those aren't civilian groupings, Morgan. You're compensating for wind, adjusting elevation. That's trained behavior. Flynn's hand moved casually to her side, where a concealed pistol rode in an ankle holster beneath her jeans, where 17 rounds of 9mm waited for the moment when talking stopped working and survival required different solutions. She hoped this wasn't that moment. Brennan raised a hand, silencing Nash before the confrontation could escalate. Easy, Derek. Woman knows how to shoot. That's why she's here. That's why any of us are here. He looked at Flynn. Your father taught you well, Morgan. Better than most instructors could. Flynn nodded, said nothing. Let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable and someone else filled it. Webb broke first. We need people on perimeter rotation tonight. Morgan, you're scheduled for 0200 to 0600. North fence, check in every 30 minutes. Flynn acknowledged. Grateful for the subject change, grateful to escape the range and the scrutiny and the feeling that Brennan's eyes saw more than she wanted him to see. She walked back toward the compound. Autumn sunlight painted the mountains in colors that reminded her of deployments where the terrain was beautiful and the mission was ugly, and the contradictions somehow made both more intense. Halfway back, she detoured toward the maintenance building, specifically toward the basement access that most members didn't know existed, that Brennan kept locked and guarded and restricted to senior leadership only. Flynn had learned about it 6 weeks into her infiltration, had spent 3 months planning how to access it, had finally managed it 2 weeks ago by creating a distraction that pulled guards away long enough for her to pick the lock and document what waited in the darkness below. Javelin missile launchers, 4 of them, complete systems. Missiles still in shipping containers. Serial numbers matching the inventory from Syria Depot that had been marked as destroyed in enemy airstrike, but actually had been transferred to parties unknown through channels that existed in the gray space between official and illegal. Flynn had photographed everything, encrypted the images, transmitted them through channels that bypassed normal communication networks, and went directly to people who operated in spaces most Americans didn't know existed. She had expected immediate action, raids, arrests, the full weight of federal law enforcement descending on the compound to secure weapons that could bring down aircraft or destroy armored vehicles or kill dozens of people in the kind of attack that dominated news cycles for weeks. Instead, silence. No response. No acknowledgement. No indication anyone had received her intelligence or cared about its implications. That silence had lasted 3 weeks. Long enough for Flynn to wonder if her handlers had been compromised. Long enough to consider extraction. Long enough to question whether the mission still mattered or if she was trapped in a situation that would end the way Syria ended. With betrayal and bodies and explanations that satisfied bureaucrats, but not the people who survived. Then yesterday, the FBI had raided a safe house 12 miles from the compound, arrested 2 coalition members on weapons charges, seized documents that Flynn recognized as logistics manifests she had photographed and transmitted weeks ago. The FBI was closing in, which meant Flynn's time was running out, which meant she needed to identify who supplied the javelins and why, and what their connection was to Syria, before federal agents who didn't know the full picture triggered a confrontation that would end in bloodshed and destroy evidence that might be the only way to prove what really happened to 6 Marines in a classified mission that officially never occurred. She reached her quarters, checked her encrypted phone, one message, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. FBI raid imminent. Estimate 36 to 48 hours. Maintain cover. 0 casualties. Acknowledge. Flynn deleted the message, burned the acknowledgement into memory instead of transmitting it. Sometimes the absence of communication was safer than communication itself. Sometimes silence was the only OPSEC that mattered. She changed into work clothes, grabbed tools from her locker, headed toward the fence line where maintenance provided cover for surveillance, and surveillance provided intelligence that might make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The afternoon passed in the kind of routine that made deep cover operations sustainable. Physical labor, casual conversations, the mundane details of maintaining a compound that housed 200 people who believed collapse was coming, and preparation was the only rational response. Flynn repaired fence, cleared brush, pretended to care about the same things everyone else cared about while her mind worked through scenarios and contingencies and the question that had haunted her for 2 years. Who betrayed Syria? It wasn't a simple question. Betrayal required motive and means and opportunity, required someone high enough to access classified mission parameters, but positioned to benefit from their compromise, required connections to networks that moved weapons and money and intelligence across borders that existed more on paper than in practice. Flynn had narrowed the suspects to 3 possibilities: all flag officers, all with Syria connections, all with access to the kind of classified information that could turn a routine raid into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. But suspicion wasn't proof, and proof required evidence, and evidence required risks that got people killed when the people being investigated had resources that dwarfed anything Flynn could access alone. She needed allies, needed someone who cared about truth more than career, needed the kind of institutional support that could protect witnesses and analyze evidence and build cases strong enough to survive the political pressure that would come when powerful people discovered their crimes had been exposed. She didn't have any of that. What she had was a compound full of paranoid veterans who would kill her if they discovered her identity, an FBI investigation that would arrest her along with everyone else if they raided before she completed her mission, and handlers who sent cryptic messages demanding 0 casualties while providing 0 support. The sun dropped toward the horizon. Temperature fell. Montana autumn meant cold nights and colder mornings, and the kind of weather that made perimeter guard duty miserable for everyone, except people who had pulled worse duty in worse places under worse conditions. Flynn finished her work, returned tools, grabbed dinner from the mess hall, ate alone while watching Brennan brief the senior members about something that involved serious expressions and concerned nods and the body language of people discussing threats they took seriously. After dinner, mandatory assembly in the main hall. 200 members gathered. The hall was designed for it. Rows of folding chairs facing a raised platform where Brennan stood with the bearing of someone who had commanded larger formations and deadlier missions and never lost the presence that made people listen when he spoke. Flynn took a seat into the back, close to exits, habit born from training that taught you to always know where the doors were and how long it would take to reach them if everything went wrong. Brennan waited for silence, got it without asking, the kind of authority that came from respect instead of rank, from credibility instead of credentials, from men and women who followed you because they believed in you instead of because regulations required it. Brothers and sisters, Brennan's voice carried without shouting, we have a situation. He triggered a projector, displayed surveillance photos on the screen behind him. FBI agents, vehicles, equipment staging, Osain areas. The kind of preparation that preceded major operations against people the government had decided were too dangerous to leave free. FBI raided one of our safe houses yesterday, arrested 2 members, seized documents and equipment. We have confirmed reports they're building a case against this compound, against all of us. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, fear and anger in equal measure. The specific kind of fear that came from people who had survived government operations in foreign countries and understood what those operations looked like when the government decided you were the target instead of the asset. Derek Nash stood. We can't let them Ruby Ridge us, can't let them turn this into another Waco. We have to make a stand. Agreement from several members. The kind of angry agreement that escalated situations into tragedies that everyone regretted and no one could undo. Brennan raised his hand. Silence returned. We're not making a stand, Derek. We're making a choice. We can fight We can flee, or we can negotiate. Fighting ends with casualties on both sides and martyrs instead of justice. Fleeing ends with manhunts and arrests and everything we've built destroyed. Negotiating ends with lawyers and cameras and the kind of public scrutiny that makes it harder for them to disappear us. Flynn watched faces around the room, saw people processing options, saw the veterans among them recognizing Brennan's logic, saw the anger slowly replaced by the kind of tactical thinking that came from people trained to analyze situations instead of react to them. Here's what we're going to do, Brennan continued. We document everything. Every weapon is registered and legal. Every member has clean background. We set up cameras. We invite media. We make this transparent. If FBI wants to raid us, they do it in front of witnesses who will ask questions that make their superiors uncomfortable. It was a good plan, the kind that might actually work if the FBI's goal was legitimate investigation instead of something else. Something that involved evidence destruction and witness elimination and outcomes that required violence to achieve. Flynn knew the FBI's goal was legitimate, knew they were investigating weapons trafficking that connected to Syria and to javelins and to the same conspiracy she had spent 2 years trying to expose. The problem was their investigation would compromise hers, would scatter the coalition before she identified the source, would end with arrests and trials and classified testimony that protected the people at the top while punishing the ones at the bottom. She needed time, needed 48 hours to trace the javelins back to their source and document the chain of custody and build evidence that couldn't be buried under classification or destroyed by lawyers. But she also needed to prevent the bloodshed that would come if Brennan's plan failed and the FBI raid triggered exactly the kind of confrontation both sides claimed they wanted to avoid, but both sides were preparing for anyway. After the assembly, members dispersed. Flynn headed toward the armory to check out night vision equipment for her perimeter shift. The armory was quiet, just her and the duty officer who logged equipment with the kind of attention to detail that suggested military background and the kind of paranoia that suggested he took accountability seriously. She signed for PVS 14 night vision monocular. Spare batteries. Radio with encrypted channel. Standard loadout for a perimeter guard in a compound that took security seriously. The duty officer handed her the equipment. His eyes lingered on her face. You ever served, Morgan? Flynn's pulse quickened. No, just trained by someone who did. Your father. Yes? The officer nodded. You move like you served. Carry yourself like you've been downrange. Just an observation. Flynn shouldered her pack. Thanks. I'll take that as a compliment. She left before he could ask more questions. Before observation became investigation. Before the carefully constructed cover started showing cracks that would widen into exposure. Outside, darkness had fallen. Montana night sky painted in stars that seemed closer here than anywhere Flynn had been. The kind of sky that made you remember how small you were and how big the universe was and how none of your problems mattered to stars that had been burning for billions of years and would keep burning long after you and your problems turned to dust. Flynn walked toward the north fence, her assigned sector for the next 4 hours. 4 hours of cold and solitude and the kind of thinking that happened when you had nothing to do but watch darkness and wait for threats that might or might not come. She activated her night vision. The world turned green. Trees became geometric shapes. The fence became a glowing line separating relative safety from absolute wilderness. Movement drew her attention. Deer probably, maybe elk. The kind of wildlife that didn't care about human concerns and human conflicts and human tendency to make everything more complicated than it needed to be. Her radio crackled. Check in from command. North fence status. Flynn keyed her mic. North fence all clear. Copy. Next check 30 minutes. The radio went silent. Flynn settled into position that gave her sight lines along the fence and into the tree line and toward the compound behind her. Triangle of observation. Nothing happened in any direction without her noticing. She thought about Hale, about the last conversation they had before Syria, when he pulled her aside and talked about philosophy instead of tactics, about the difference between soldiers who killed because they had to and soldiers who killed because they could, about competence as moral responsibility, about how the best snipers were the ones who understood their power and chose to use it sparingly. Fire and vanish, Flynn, he had said. Every shot must answer a question. Is this kill necessary? If the answer is no, find another way. Always find another way. She had tried to live by that principle, had made it through 2 years and 17 missions without a single confirmed kill, had disabled vehicles and destroyed equipment and neutralized threats through methods that didn't require body counts or casualty reports or the kind of paperwork that followed lethal force. 0 necessary kills. It was harder than most people realized. Required creativity and precision and the willingness to take risks that killing eliminated. required you to be better than good, required you to be exceptional in moments when exceptional was the only thing that kept people alive. The night deepened, temperature dropped, Flynn's breath fogged in the glow of her night vision. She walked her patrol route, north fence to west corner to compound gate, gate back to north fence. Circular pattern that took 20 minutes and left 10 minutes for observation before the next cycle. On her third circuit, movement in the tree line stopped her. Not deer this time. Human. Single figure. Prone position. Thermal signature suggesting recent activity. Range approximately 400 meters. Positioned for observation of the compound with sight lines that would allow photography or surveillance or the kind of intelligence gathering that preceded operations. FBI forward observer. Flynn could have reported it, could have triggered compound alert, and watched as armed members responded with the kind of aggressive posture that would justify FBI claims about dangerous extremists. Could have let the situation escalate into exactly the kind of confrontation that would end her mission and probably end lives. She chose differently. Flynn circled wide, used terrain to approach from an angle the observer wouldn't expect, moved with silence that came from training that cost more than most people earned in a year, and produced capabilities that most people didn't believe existed outside of movies. 300 meters, 200, 100. She could see the observer clearly now. Female, mid-30s, professional equipment, spotting scope and camera with telephoto lens, radio earpiece, the posture of someone who had done this before and knew how to do it well. Flynn stopped at 50 meters, close enough to identify, close enough to engage if necessary, close enough to make a choice that would matter. She could neutralize the observer, non-lethally, disable the equipment and scatter the surveillance and buy time for the compound to prepare. It would compromise her cover, but it would also demonstrate loyalty to the coalition and probably elevate her to trusted status that would give her access to information she couldn't get otherwise. Or she could let the observer continue, let the FBI gather intelligence, let the investigation proceed knowing it would eventually connect dots that led to the same place Flynn was trying to reach through different methods. The question Hale taught her to ask arrived right on schedule. Is this action necessary? Flynn decided it wasn't. Withdrew the way she came, silent, undetected, leaving the FBI observer to do her job while Flynn did hers. She completed her patrol, called in her final check, returned equipment to the armory, headed toward her quarters knowing that somewhere in the darkness, federal agents were analyzing photographs and building case files and preparing operations that would collide with hers in approximately 36 hours. Her encrypted phone vibrated. New message. Surveillance confirmed. FBI breach window now estimated 36 hours. Extraction available if you abort. Recommend abort. 0 casualties requirement stands. Acknowledge. Flynn stared at the message. Abort meant leaving. Meant 2 years of work ending without answers. Meant the people who betrayed Syria would never face justice. Meant Hale died for nothing, and Luis Torres died for nothing, and Ryan Brennan died for nothing. And the only lesson anyone learned was that betraying your own was profitable if you were connected enough and careful enough and willing to let other people pay the price. She deleted the message without acknowledging. Sometimes the absence of response was the clearest response possible. Flynn stripped off her gear, showered in the communal facility where water ran cold enough to keep showers brief, changed into sleep clothes, lay on her bunk staring at the ceiling and thinking about choices and consequences in the narrow path between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sleep didn't come easy, never did anymore. Syria had taken that from her along with everything else, had replaced restful sleep with the kind where you woke every 90 minutes to check your perimeter and verify your weapon and remind yourself that you were safe, even though safe was a word that stopped meaning anything the day you watched 5 people die and realized you survived because someone chose to save you instead of completing the mission. Survivor's guilt was the clinical term. Flynn didn't find clinical terms particularly useful. What she found useful was work, purpose, the mission that gave her reason to wake up and keep moving and prove that her survival meant something more than statistical luck. Dawn came cold and gray. Flynn rose before the compound woke, ran perimeter, 5 miles at pace that would have impressed recruiters and worried surveillance teams who might wonder why a construction worker had the cardiovascular capacity of someone who ran with weighted pack for training instead of recreation. She finished her run, showered again, headed to breakfast where the same weak coffee and same hard eggs waited like old friends who never changed and never left. The mess hall buzzed with tension. Members clustered in groups discussing yesterday's briefing and FBI movements and contingency plans that ranged from reasonable to reckless. Flynn sat alone, listened without appearing to listen. The skill that came from years of gathering intelligence in environments where people talked freely around those they didn't consider threats. She was halfway through breakfast when Brennan appeared beside her table. "Morgan, my office, 5 minutes." Then he was gone, leaving Flynn with half-eaten eggs, an accelerating heartbeat, and the specific kind of adrenaline that came from knowing the next 5 minutes might determine whether you lived or died. She finished her coffee, stood, walked toward Brennan's office with the controlled pace of someone who wasn't worried, because worry suggested guilt, and guilt suggested something to hide. Brennan's office occupied the northeast corner of the main building, window overlooking the compound, desk cluttered with maps and manifests, and the administrative debris of running an organization that existed in the gray space between legal and investigated. Brennan sat behind the desk, gestured to the chair across from him. Flynn sat, kept her hands visible, kept her expression neutral, waited for him to speak first because people who spoke first often revealed more than people who spoke second. Brennan studied her for a long moment. His eyes carried weight that suggested he knew things Flynn hoped he didn't know and suspected things Flynn couldn't let him confirm. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a folder, set it between them. Inside the folder lay a photograph. Master Chief Kara Flynn, United States Marine Corps, official portrait from her promotion ceremony. Dress blues, ribbons. The pride that came from earning rank through competence instead of connections. Next to Flynn's photo lay another. Captain Ryan Brennan. Same dress blues, same pride. The kind of photo families kept on mantles and remembered when they needed to remember what duty looked like before it killed the people who believed in it. Brennan's voice was quiet, controlled. The kind of control that suggested emotion underneath, waiting for permission to surface. "I don't know who sent you, Morgan. FBI, ATF, CIA, some alphabet agency that operates in spaces most Americans don't know exist. But I know you're not construction worker from Boise. I know that photo isn't a coincidence, and I know my son died calling your name." Flynn's training kicked in. Threat assessment, exit routes, weapons available, Brennan's holstered pistol, letter opener on the desk, window behind her that would require 2 seconds to reach and 3 seconds to breach. She could be gone in 5 seconds, could disappear into Montana wilderness and trigger extraction and be on a plane to somewhere classified before Brennan finished processing what happened. But that would end the mission, would leave questions unanswered and justice unserved, and the people who betrayed Syria free to betray others. Flynn made her choice. She met Brennan's eyes, didn't flinch, didn't look away. "What do you want from me, Colonel?" Brennan leaned back. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite trust, not quite acceptance. Something more complicated that suggested he had expected her to run and found her staying more interesting than her fleeing. "I want to know what happened in Syria. I want to know how my son died. And I want to know why you're here in my compound pretending to be someone you're not, while FBI circles like vultures and weapons that shouldn't exist sit in my basement waiting to be used for purposes I don't fully understand." Flynn's mind raced through options. Denial would fail. Her cover was blown. Brennan had evidence and suspicion and the kind of determination that came from fathers who lost sons and needed answers more than they needed safety. Partial truth might work. Give him enough to satisfy while holding back enough to protect the mission. Or full truth. The risky option. The one that required trusting a man she had been investigating for 10 months. The one that violated every protocol and probably ended her career if it went wrong. Flynn decided protocols were written by people who had never faced the specific situation she faced right now. "I can't tell you everything, Colonel, but I can tell you this. Your son died a hero. Luis Torres died a hero, and the 4 others died heroes. They died because someone high up sold them out. Someone who traded American lives for profit. Someone who's still out there, still in uniform, still giving orders, still trusted." Brennan's jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm here. Those javelins in your basement. They came from Syria. Same depot my team raided 3 days before the ambush. Someone diverted them. Someone who knew our mission parameters. Someone who used that knowledge to set a trap. And you think I'm connected? I thought you might be. 10 months ago. Now I think you're a victim, same as me. Someone armed your coalition with Syria weapons to frame you, to discredit you, to create a domestic terrorism narrative that buries the real story under headlines about dangerous veterans and government overreach." Brennan was quiet, processing, analyzing, the way good commanders did when presented with intelligence that changed their understanding of the battlefield. Finally, he spoke. "FBI raids this compound in 36 hours, maybe less. When they do, they find javelins. They arrest everyone. They destroy evidence. And whoever betrayed Syria walks away clean while we rot in federal prison for crimes we didn't commit." "Yes. So what do you propose?" Flynn leaned forward. "I propose we help each other. You want answers about Ryan. I want answers about Syria. FBI wants the javelins. We can give everyone what they want if we move fast and smart and don't let this turn into the bloodbath both sides are preparing for. How? I delay FBI for 48 hours, non-violently, zero casualties. While I delay them, you help me trace those javelins back to their source. We find who supplied you. We document everything. We build evidence that survives classification and can't be buried. Then we give FBI the javelins and the evidence, and we walk away clean while the real criminals face justice. Brennan studied her. You're asking me to trust you, to believe a woman who lied about her identity for 10 months suddenly wants to help me. I'm asking you to trust that we want the same thing. Justice for Syria. Truth about what happened. And outcomes that don't end with more bodies or more lies or more families wondering why their sons died for nothing. Silence stretched. Brennan's eyes never left Flynn's face. Reading her, analyzing, looking for deception or manipulation or the kind of tells that suggested ulterior motives. Whatever he saw, it satisfied him. He opened his laptop, played a video, helmet camera footage. Syria, night vision green. The raid Flynn remembered in fragments because trauma did that. It took whole memories and shattered them into pieces that reassembled wrong, or not at all, or only when you didn't want them to. The video showed what Flynn couldn't remember. Showed her fighting to reach Ryan Brennan. Showed her taking fire to cover his position. Showed Hale pulling her away as the building collapsed. Showed her screaming Ryan's name while Hale dragged her toward the extraction point. Showed the last thing she saw before unconsciousness took her. Luis Torres running toward the collapse instead of away. Running toward Ryan because that was what brothers did, even when running toward meant dying with instead of living without. The video ended. Brennan's voice was rough, thick with emotion held barely in check. I've watched this footage 1,000 times, trying to find someone to blame, trying to understand why my son died while others lived, trying to make sense of senseless things. He looked at Flynn. I blamed you for 2 years, the one who survived, the one who got pulled away, the one who kept breathing while Ryan's breath stopped. But watching this, seeing what you tried to do, seeing Luis make the choice he made, I realize blame is easy and truth is hard, and the people who deserve blame are the ones who sent good men into bad situations for reasons that had nothing to do with honor or duty or any of the things we tell ourselves to sleep at night. Flynn's throat tightened. 2 years of carrying guilt she couldn't articulate. 2 years of survivor's burden that no amount of therapy or time or distance could eliminate. 2 years of asking herself if she could have done something different, something more, something that saved everyone instead of just herself. I tried to reach him, Colonel. I swear I tried. I know. I see it. And I see why Hale pulled you away. You die there. 6 others die because you're not covering their extraction. Mission math. Terrible math. But math that commanders make when every option costs lives and the best you can do is minimize the cost. Brennan closed the laptop. 48 hours. You delay FBI. I help you find the source. We do this right. We do this clean. 0 casualties, like you said. He extended his hand. Flynn took it. The deal was struck. Somewhere in the darkness, FBI surveillance teams photographed the handshake through telephoto lenses and added it to files that would eventually land on desks belonging to people who would make decisions that affected lives Flynn couldn't save and missions she couldn't complete. And outcomes that 2 years ago she believed she could control, but now understood she could only influence at the margins, while hoping influence was enough. She walked out of Brannan's office into Montana morning that smelled like autumn and felt like winter approaching and carried the weight of choices that would matter more than Flynn realized when she made them. 48 hours, 0 casualties, answers about Syria. It sounded simple. Flynn knew nothing about the next 2 days would be simple at all. The deal was 48 hours. Flynn had negotiated longer operations under worse conditions, but never with a clock this visible and stakes this personal, and variables this unpredictable. 48 hours to delay FBI tactical teams who had budgets and technology and legal authority. 48 hours to trace weapons that traveled through networks designed to be untraceable. 48 hours to prove that 6 Marines died because of treason instead of tactical failure. The clock started the moment Flynn walked out of Brennan's office into Montana morning that had shifted from cold to colder. The kind of weather that reminded you winter was coming, whether you were ready or not, whether your mission was complete or not, whether the people hunting you cared about temperature or terrain or anything except putting you in handcuffs or body bags depending on how much resistance you offered. Flynn's first move was tactical assessment. FBI had forward observers positioned in tree line. She had spotted one last night during perimeter patrol. Professional, patient, the kind that suggested serious resources and serious intent. If there was one observer, there were probably 4. Standard practice for surveillance operations against hardened targets. She needed to map their positions without revealing she knew they existed, needed to understand their coverage and their blind spots and the routes they would use when surveillance transitioned to action. Brennan found her near the armory reviewing compound maps that showed fence lines and buildings and terrain features that mattered when you were planning defense or escape or the kind of controlled chaos that looked like panic but was actually precision. FBI will move soon, Brennan said quietly. No one else within earshot, but he kept his voice low anyway. Paranoia was survival in environments where walls had ears, and loyalty was conditional, and trust was currency that depreciated fast. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning, but soon. Flynn traced a finger along the northern perimeter. They have observers here, probably here and here. 4 positions. Overlapping fields of fire. They're waiting for additional assets before they move. How do you know? Because that's what I would do. You don't raid a compound full of combat veterans with just surveillance teams. You wait for tactical units. SWAT, hostage rescue if you think there's risk of barricade situation. They're building force package now. 48 hours is probably optimistic. We might have 36. Brennan studied the map. What do we need? We need to make them think they have more time than they do. We need to create the impression we're not going anywhere, not preparing to fight, not preparing to flee. Just normal operations by people who don't know they're being watched. And while they're watching us pretend to be normal, Flynn pulled a different map from the stack. This one showed roads and trails and the kind of terrain features that didn't appear on official maps but mattered when you needed to move without being seen. I find who supplied those javelins. I follow the chain. I document everything. And I give you answers about Syria that might not be the answers you want, but will be the truth. Brennan's jaw tightened. I've spent 2 years wanting answers. I can handle truth. Flynn wasn't sure that was accurate, but didn't argue. People thought they wanted truth until truth arrived and revealed itself to be uglier and more complicated than the comfortable lies they had been telling themselves. She had learned that in Syria when the truth about institutional betrayal replaced the comfortable lie about tactical mistakes. They spent the next hour planning. Brennan would maintain normal compound operations, training schedules, maintenance rotations, guard duty. Everything that suggested business as usual. Flynn would use that cover to access the basement, to photograph serial numbers and shipping manifests and any documentation that might trace the javelins back through the supply chain. It wasn't much of a plan, but operations never survived first contact anyway. The best you could do was establish objectives and maintain flexibility and adapt when everything went wrong, because everything always went wrong. Flynn left Brennan reviewing duty rosters, walked toward the mess hall where breakfast cleanup provided cover for the kind of observation that looked casual but was actually systematic. She cataloged faces and body language in the subtle tells that separated people who were nervous because FBI was coming from people who were nervous because they had secrets worth hiding. Derek Nash fell into the second category. He sat alone at a corner table, coffee gone cold in front of him. His eyes tracked Flynn with the intensity of someone who suspected but couldn't prove, who had questions but couldn't ask without revealing he had been asking. Flynn ignored him. Attention was currency, and Nash didn't deserve the exchange rate. She grabbed coffee that was marginally better than yesterday's, found a seat near the window where she could watch the compound yard and the fence line in the mountains beyond, where FBI observers were probably watching her through optics that cost more than most people's cars. Her encrypted phone vibrated. Text message, timestamp 6 minutes ago. Surveillance package expanded, 4 observers, now 8. Expect tactical arrival within 24 hours. Abort still available. Acknowledge. Flynn deleted the message, poured her coffee down the drain, walked outside into cold that bit through her jacket, and reminded her that comfort was temporary, and suffering was the price of mission completion. She needed to move faster than planned. 24 hours instead of 48 changed everything. Changed timelines and options and the margin for error that had already been thin enough to see through. The basement access was locked. Heavy deadbolt, electronic keypad, the kind of security that kept casual members out but wouldn't stop someone with training and tools and the understanding that locks were psychology as much as mechanics. They existed to make people believe entry was impossible, so they stopped trying before testing whether belief matched reality. Flynn had tested, had picked the lock 2 weeks ago during her initial reconnaissance, had memorized the code by watching Brennan's finger movements through a spotting scope positioned 300 meters away, had documented everything and transmitted it through channels that apparently led to people who received intelligence and did nothing except send messages demanding she abort missions they weren't willing to support. She picked the lock again. Faster this time. 23 seconds. Inside, stairs descended into darkness that smelled like concrete and gun oil, and the specific mustiness of underground spaces where air circulated poorly and moisture accumulated, and time moved differently than the surface world. Flynn activated a penlight, descended, reached the bottom where the javelin crates waited like evidence in a trial that hadn't started but would end with someone going to prison if justice worked the way people claimed it worked. 4 crates, complete systems, command launch units, missiles, batteries, everything needed to engage armor or aircraft or buildings at ranges that made conventional weapons irrelevant. The kind of capability that changed battlefields and decided outcomes and was supposed to be restricted to forces authorized by people who understood the implications of giving that kind of power to anyone. Flynn photographed the serial numbers again. Different angles this time, better lighting, the kind of documentation that would survive legal challenges and classification reviews and the bureaucratic machinery that ground up evidence and spit out redactions. She pulled shipping manifests from a file cabinet that Brennan apparently used for documentation because even paranoid militia leaders understood paper trails mattered when you needed to prove weapons were acquired legally instead of through channels that would land everyone involved in federal prison. The manifest told a story, a complicated story, the kind that required expertise to decode because military logistics involved acronyms and codes and routing numbers that looked random but actually contained information if you knew how to read them. Flynn knew how to read them. The javelins had originated from Marine Corps Depot in Albany, Georgia. Standard procedure, weapons went to Albany for maintenance and distribution. From there, they should have gone to operational units. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, wherever Marines were deployed and needed capabilities that javelins provided. These javelins went to Syria, March 2019. Requisition signed by Captain Luis Torres, logistics officer, the man who would die 3 days later in an ambush that killed 5 Marines and traumatized the one who survived. Flynn stared at Torres' signature. Luis Torres, Vic Shelton's brother, the man who ran toward Ryan Brennan when everyone else ran away. The man whose death FBI probably blamed on Flynn because survivors were easier to blame than systems that failed and conspiracies that succeeded. She photographed the signature, the routing numbers, the transfer authorization that should have sent these weapons to Syrian Democratic forces, but apparently redirected them to Taliban elements who used them to kill the very people who were supposed to be armed with them. Her light caught something else, a second signature on the authorization form. Approval signature, required for transfers of this classification level. Brigadier General Carson Vega, Joint Special Operations Command, Logistics and Supply Chain Oversight, Syria Theater Operations, 2019. Flynn's blood ran cold. Vega was the architect, the one who approved transfers, the one who knew mission parameters because he controlled the logistics that enabled missions, the one who could redirect weapons and falsify paperwork and create the kind of betrayal that looked like accidents until you examined it closely enough to see the pattern. But the manifest revealed more. Another document attached, handwritten notes in margins. Flynn photographed everything, then read more carefully. The javelins had been diverted to Taliban in March 2019, used in the ambush that killed 6 Marines, but the story didn't end there. In October 2020, 18 months after Syria, coalition forces raided a Taliban weapons cache near the Pakistan border, recovered military equipment including 3 Javelin systems, serial numbers matching the Syria diversion. Standard procedure would send recovered weapons back to depot, destroy them, or redistribute to authorized units. But these javelins took a different path, through a network of corrupt contractors, through black market channels that specialized in moving military hardware to buyers who didn't ask questions and paid premiums for American technology. The manifest showed the road. October 2020, recovery. November 2020, marked as destroyed in official records. December 2020, sold to private military contractor for training purposes. January 2021, resold to domestic buyer through intermediary. February 2021, delivered to Montana. The buyer's signature was illegible, but the delivery authorization was clear. Approved by Captain Marcus Diaz, Pentagon Logistics Coordinator, the same officer who had supervised weapons movements in Syria, the same officer Torres had reported discrepancies to 2 weeks before the ambush. Flynn photographed everything, the chain of custody that connected Syria to Taliban, to black market, to Montana. The signatures that proved institutional corruption spanning 3 years in multiple continents. The evidence that would survive classification because it documented crimes too systematic to dismiss as isolated incidents. She was finishing documentation when footsteps on the stairs interrupted her work. Flynn killed her light, moved behind the javelin crates. Her hand found the pistol at her waist. 9mm, 17 rounds. Enough to handle most threats, but not enough if the threat involved multiple hostiles with automatic weapons and tactical training. The footsteps reached the bottom. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouette backlit by pale light filtering from above. Derek Nash. He held a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. Both pointed at the crates where Flynn hid. His voice carried the tension of someone expecting confrontation and preparing for violence. I know you're down here, Morgan, or whoever you really are. Come out slow, hands visible. We're going to have a conversation about who you work for and what you're doing in our compound. Flynn calculated options. Nash was paranoid but not stupid. Former infantry, combat experienced. The kind of opponent who would shoot if surprised and ask questions after bodies stopped twitching. Fighting him would violate the zero casualties principle, would alert the compound, would end her mission and probably end her life when 200 armed veterans responded to gunfire in their basement. She needed a different solution. Flynn stood, slowly, hands raised, visible, non-threatening posture that suggested surrender instead of the violence she could deploy in the 3 seconds it would take Nash to process that she wasn't actually surrendering at all. Easy, Derek, I'm not armed. A lie, but useful lie. The kind that bought time while she positioned for options Nash wouldn't see until too late. Nash's flashlight found her face. His pistol tracked center mass. Professional, controlled. The muscle memory of someone who had pointed weapons at people before and understood the mechanics of aimed fire under stress. Explain why you're in a restricted area photographing equipment you have no authorization to access. Flynn kept her voice calm, level. Colonel Brennan asked me to inventory the weapons. We're preparing documentation for when FBI arrives. Proof of legal acquisition, paper trail that keeps everyone out of prison. It was a good lie, plausible. The kind Brennan might actually order if he was preparing for federal scrutiny. The kind that explained her presence without raising additional questions. Nash didn't buy it. Brennan didn't mention anything about inventory. And even if he did, he wouldn't send you. Wouldn't send someone he just met. Wouldn't trust a woman who showed up 10 months ago with convenient story and skills that don't match her background. Flynn adjusted her stance. Fractional movement. The kind that looked like nervous shifting, but actually positioned her weight for action if action became necessary. Call him then. Ask him yourself. Clear this up before it becomes a problem neither of us needs. Nash considered. His flashlight beamed steady on Flynn's face. His pistol unwavering. Decision calculus happening behind eyes that had seen enough combat to know the difference between legitimate threat and manufactured crisis. Finally, he lowered the pistol. Not holstering it, just lowering to low-ready position that allowed quick engagement if Flynn proved more dangerous than she appeared. We go upstairs together, we talk to Brennan, and if your story checks out, you live. If it doesn't, you don't leave this compound except in a body bag. Flynn nodded. Fair enough? They climbed the stairs, Nash behind her, maintaining distance that prevented disarms but allowed clear shot if she bolted. Smart, tactical, exactly what Flynn would do if positions were reversed. Outside, compound activity had increased. Members moving with purpose instead of routine. The kind of energy that preceded operations or evacuations or the moments when organizations decided fight or flight and prepared for consequences of either choice. Brennan emerged from the command building, saw Flynn and Nash approaching, read the situation in the way Nash held his weapon and Flynn held her hands, in the distance between them that spoke volumes about trust levels. Problem? Brennan's voice carried authority that made Nash straighten slightly, despite the weapon in his hand. Nash gestured toward Flynn with his pistol. Found her in the basement, photographing the javelins. She says you sent her to inventory weapons, that true? Brennan didn't hesitate, didn't look at Flynn for confirmation or clarification, just answered with the confidence of someone telling truth instead of covering for infiltrator. That's accurate. I assigned and bargained to document our equipment. FBI will demand proof of legal acquisition. We need paper trails that survive scrutiny. Morgan has background in inventory management from her construction work. She's qualified for the task. It was smooth, professional, the kind of cover that Brennan provided without being asked because he understood operational security and the importance of maintaining Flynn's cover until the mission was complete. Nash studied both of them, looking for tells, for the small details that separated truth from deception, for the inconsistencies that revealed conspiracies and betrayals, and the kind of coordination that suggested alliance instead of chance. Whatever he saw, it didn't satisfy him completely, but satisfied him enough to lower his weapon. Apologies, Colonel. Morgan. Just being cautious. Can't be too careful with FBI circling. Brennan clapped Nash on the shoulder. Your caution keeps us safe, Derek. Keep being cautious. But trust that I know what I'm doing and who I trust. Nash nodded, holstered his weapon. walked away with the stiff posture of someone who had been mildly embarrassed but remained convinced his suspicion was justified even if his timing was wrong. When he was out of earshot, Brennan turned to Flynn. That was close. Too close. He's watching me now. Watching us. If he sees anything that confirms his suspicion, he'll act. And when he acts, 200 members will back him regardless of what you say. Then we move faster. What did you find in the basement? Flynn pulled out her phone, showed him the photographs, the manifests, the signatures that told the story of betrayal executed at levels high enough to require general officer approval and coordination that spanned continents and operations that existed in classified spaces where oversight was theoretical and accountability was optional. The chain of custody that connected Syria to Taliban, to Black Market, to Montana. The proof that these weapons had killed Marines, been recovered, then deliberately diverted again through networks that profited from American deaths. Brennan stared at the screen, at Luis Torres's signature, at Carson Vega's approval, at the documentation that proved his son died not because of tactical mistakes, but because someone in command decided 6 Marines were acceptable losses if their deaths protected profitable weapons trafficking. At Diaz's name appearing twice, once approving the Syria transfer, once authorizing the Montana delivery 18 months later. Vega, the name came out like a curse, like something that tasted wrong. He was at Ryan's memorial service, gave the eulogy, talked about sacrifice and honor and the price of freedom, and the whole time he knew because he caused it. Flynn watched emotions cross Brennan's face, grief and rage, and the specific kind of betrayal that came from discovering institutions you trusted had betrayed you in ways that made trust itself seem naive. And Diaz, Flynn added, he's the logistics coordinator, the one who made it happen twice. Syria diversion and Montana delivery. He's still active duty, still has access, still moving weapons through channels he controls. Where is Vega now? Brennan asked. Brennan pulled out his own phone, searched, found what he was looking for, and turned the screen toward Flynn. News article, Veterans Day ceremony, Arlington National Cemetery, 3 days from now. Keynote speaker, Brigadier General Carson Vega. Topic, honoring the fallen. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Flynn studied the article. Date, time, location, security protocols, the kind of event that attracted dignitaries and press and public attention that made operations difficult but also made cover-ups harder. This is it, she said. This is where we expose him. Public ceremony, cameras, witnesses. He can't bury evidence when everything happens in front of people who will ask questions. Brennan's expression hardened. FBI raids us before then. We have maybe 24 hours before tactical teams arrive. Not enough time to get to Arlington. Not enough time to coordinate anything that doesn't end with us in handcuffs or worse. Then we give FBI reason to delay. We make them think they have more time than they do. We create situations that require their attention elsewhere. How? Flynn's mind worked through possibilities, through scenarios and contingencies, and the kind of creative problem-solving that separated adequate operators from exceptional ones. The kind Hale had taught her when he explained that competence meant having options and excellence meant creating options that didn't exist until you made them exist. But she also understood what Vega had done, why he had armed the coalition with evidence of his own crime. It wasn't stupidity, it was strategy. Vega intended you as scapegoat, Flynn said. Domestic extremists with stolen military weapons. Perfect narrative. If his trafficking gets exposed, blame falls on militia instead of Pentagon. You get raided, weapons get seized, media focuses on dangerous veterans. Real story gets buried under headlines about domestic terrorism. Vega walks away clean while you take the fall. Brennan's jaw tightened, understanding the full scope of manipulation. He used us twice, first to hide his crime, then to take blame for it. Exactly. Which means we flip his strategy. We make ourselves so visible, so public, that raiding us creates more questions than it answers. We force FBI to slow down, to verify, to make sure they're not walking into political disaster. We stage an evacuation, Flynn said. We load vehicles. We create the appearance we're preparing to scatter. But instead of actually leaving, we just reposition within compound. Make them commit surveillance resources to tracking movements that don't lead anywhere. Buy ourselves the time we need. It was risky, required coordination and discipline, and the ability to execute deception operations against opponents who were trained to detect deception. But risk was relative, and the alternative was watching Vega walk free while 6 Marines remained dead and unavenged and forgotten, except by people who had no power to seek justice. Brennan nodded slowly. I'll brief the leadership. Get everyone on board we execute tonight after dark. Make it look real enough to convince FBI we're rabbiting. They separated. Brennan toward the command building. Flynn toward her quarters where equipment and planning and the solitude of preparation waited like old friends who never left. Inside her room, Flynn laid out gear. Tactical vest, plate carrier, night vision. Weapons that officially didn't exist in her locker, but had been there since week 2 of her infiltration because preparation mattered more than regulations, when regulations were written by people who never operated in environments where preparation determined survival. Her encrypted phone vibrated. Another message. This one longer than usual, more detailed. The kind that suggested her handlers had shifted from recommending abort to demanding it. Intelligence indicates FBI tactical arrival imminent. Estimate 6 to 8 hours. Breach likely tonight. Extraction team position. Authorization granted for immediate abort. 0 casualties requirement waived if necessary for survival. Acknowledge immediately. Flynn read the message 3 times. Waived 0 casualties requirement. They were giving her permission to kill if that's what it took to escape. Permission to abandon the philosophy Hale had taught her, and she had spent 2 years proving worked. She deleted the message without acknowledging. Some permissions weren't worth accepting, even when accepting them was easier than refusing them. The afternoon passed in the kind of controlled chaos that preceded operations. Members loading vehicles, securing equipment. The coordinated activity that looked like evacuation preparations and was exactly that, except the evacuation would stop at the fence line instead of continuing to wherever FBI expected them to go. Flynn helped load a truck with supplies, moved with the rhythm of people who had done this before, who understood the mechanics of rapid departure and the importance of looking busy while actually accomplishing objectives that had nothing to do with the apparent activity. Brennan appeared beside her as she secured cargo straps. FBI is repositioning, he said quietly. Our counter-surveillance spotted them moving assets. They're preparing for our departure, taking positions along roads they think we'll use. Good. Means they're committing resources to wrong location. Means when we don't show up where they expect, they'll have to scramble. Scrambling creates confusion. Confusion creates time. How much time? Maybe 12 hours, enough to execute next phase. Which is? Flynn pulled a map from her vest, unfolded it on the truck bed, pointed to a location 40 miles northeast. There's a regional FBI field office here. Small facility. Maybe 20 personnel total. Most of them will deploy to support the raid on us, which means the office will be lightly staffed, which means it's vulnerable to the kind of access that lets us copy files they have on this investigation. Brennan stared at the map. You want to break into an FBI office while they're raiding us? I want to access their investigation files while they're distracted raiding an empty compound. There's a difference. Both sound like suicide. Suicide is running out of options. We still have options, risky options, but options. Brennan was quiet, processing, calculating. The way commanders did when presented with plans that violated common sense but addressed strategic objectives in ways that conventional approaches couldn't. What do you need from me? I need you to maintain the deception. Keep FBI convinced you're evacuating. Keep them focused on roads and vehicles and tracking assets that lead nowhere. While they're occupied, I access their files. I find what they know about Vega. I copy everything. I get out before they realize what happened. And if you don't get out, Flynn met his eyes. Then you take what we've documented so far. You get it to media. You make enough noise that burying it becomes harder than admitting it. You make Ryan's death mean something. Brennan extended his hand. Flynn took it. The grip was firm, the kind that sealed agreements between people who understood promises mattered and failure wasn't an option, because too many people had already paid prices too high to waste their sacrifice on half measures. Darkness fell. Montana night came fast at this time of year. Temperature dropping, stars emerging. The kind of sky that made you remember how small you were and how big the problems were and how none of it mattered because the work still needed doing regardless of cosmic perspective. The convoy staged near the main gate. 10 vehicles, 40 members. Enough to look like serious evacuation, but not so many that it emptied the compound completely. The kind of presence that suggested organization instead of panic. Planning instead of reaction. Flynn watched from the shadows. Counted FBI surveillance responses, thermal signatures moving in tree line, radio traffic increasing on frequencies they thought were secure, but Flynn had been monitoring since week 1 of infiltration. The convoy rolled out. Lights, noise, the deliberate visibility of people who weren't trying to hide, who wanted to be seen because being seen created the impression they were doing what FBI expected instead of what they actually planned. 3 miles down the road, the convoy stopped, killed lights, dispersed into forests using trails that didn't appear on maps but existed for exactly this kind of operation. Within 20 minutes, all 40 members had circled back to compound using routes FBI wasn't watching because they were too busy following vehicles that led nowhere. It was beautiful, tactically elegant, the kind of deception that worked because it played on expectations instead of fighting them, because it gave FBI what they expected to see and used that expectation as camouflage for actions they wouldn't see until too late. Flynn moved while FBI was distracted tracking ghosts. She took a vehicle from the compound motor pool. Civilian truck. Nothing tactical, nothing that would attract attention on roads where attention meant questions and questions meant delays she couldn't afford. The drive to the FBI field office took 90 minutes. Rural highways, small towns that closed after dark. The kind of America that existed between the coasts and the headlines, where people worked jobs that didn't make news and lived lives that mattered to them, even if they didn't matter to people making decisions in distant cities. Flynn parked 3 blocks from the FBI office, walked the remaining distance. The building was exactly what she expected. 2-story structure, government bland, security adequate for routine operations but not hardened against the kind of access Flynn specialized in. 2 vehicles in the lot, maybe 6 personnel inside. Most of the office had deployed to Montana to support the raid that was currently chasing empty vehicles through forest, while real targets remained exactly where FBI had started looking. Flynn circled the building, mapped cameras, identified blind spots, found the weakness that every security system had because perfect security was expensive, and field offices operated on budgets that prioritize urgent over important and prevention over redundancy. She entered through a 2nd-story window. Lockpick. 40 seconds. Inside, the building smelled like every government office, coffee and toner, and the specific staleness of air conditioning that ran all night because energy conservation was someone else's budget concern. Flynn moved through darkness toward the case files. She knew where they would be because FBI procedures were standardized, and standardization meant predictability, and predictability meant advantages for people who did homework. The case room was locked. Better lock this time. Security level that required more sophisticated approach than simple picking. Flynn pulled tools from her vest, bypass kit, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent and worked on 80% of commercial security systems. 3 minutes. The lock opened. Inside, files covered tables and walls, photographs, maps, surveillance reports, everything FBI had compiled on Forgotten Veterans Coalition and the weapons trafficking investigation that had led them to Montana and to Brennan and to Flynn. She photographed everything. Systematic, methodical. The kind of documentation that survived legal challenges because it was comprehensive enough to tell complete story instead of fragments that could be dismissed as incomplete or out of context. One file caught her attention, thicker than others, classification markings that suggested content wasn't routine investigation, but something that connected to operations most Americans would never know existed. Flynn opened it. Inside, she found her own face. Master Chief Kara Flynn, United States Marine Corps, officially KYA Syria 2019. Except the file included recent photographs, surveillance images from Montana. FBI knew she was alive, knew she was in the compound, knew her identity contradicted official records. The file included something else, a personnel record for the agent leading the investigation. Special Agent Victoria Shelton, 14 years FBI, decorated, respected, and something Flynn hadn't known until this moment. Sister of Captain Luis Torres, USMCKIA Syria 2019. Flynn stared at the connection. Vic Shelton was hunting her, not because of weapons trafficking, not because of militia investigation, because Vic blamed Flynn for her brother's death, because surviving made Flynn guilty in ways that legal systems couldn't address, but personal vendettas could. The revelation changed everything, changed the nature of the hunt, changed the stakes, changed the understanding of why FBI had committed resources that seemed disproportionate to the threat level, unless the threat was personal instead of procedural. Flynn photographed Vic's file, photographed everything. She needed to understand her opponent if she was going to survive the next 24 hours. Needed to know what drove Vic beyond duty and regulation and the kind of professional obligation that could be negotiated or compromised or redirected. Personal vendetta couldn't be negotiated, could only be confronted. Flynn was finishing documentation when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. The kind that suggested return from deployment or shift change or the bad luck that turned routine operations into disasters. She killed her light, moved toward the window. Escape route planned. 3 seconds to reach it, 2 seconds to open, 1 second to drop to roof below, then gone before whoever was coming reached the case room and discovered evidence of intrusion. The door opened before she reached the window. Lights flashed on, blinding after darkness. Flynn's hand moved toward her weapon, stopped, because the person in the doorway held a pistol aimed center mass, and Flynn recognized the face from the file she had just photographed. Special Agent Victoria Shelton. They stood 3 meters apart, both armed, both trained, both understanding that the next 5 seconds would determine whether this ended in conversation or violence. And violence in FBI office meant outcomes neither of them would survive. Vic's voice was controlled, cold, the tone of someone who had imagined this confrontation and prepared for it and was now executing exactly what she had rehearsed. Master Chief Kara Flynn, you're under arrest for unauthorized access to federal facility, theft of classified documents, and about 6 other charges I'll think of while you're being processed. On your knees, hands behind your head. You know the drill. Flynn stayed standing, hands visible but not raised, not surrendering but not fighting. The space between compliance and resistance where decisions happened and outcomes balanced on edges sharp enough to cut. Your brother didn't die because of me, Agent Shelton. He died at trying to save Ryan Brennan. He died a hero, and the person who killed him is still out there, still in uniform, still trusted. Vic's weapon didn't waver. You were there. You survived. He didn't. That makes you responsible in my book. Your book is wrong, and if you arrest me now, you'll never know what really happened. You'll never get justice for Luis. You'll just get paperwork and closed cases and comfortable lies that let guilty people sleep while you spend the rest of your life wondering if you did the right thing. Tension stretched. Vic's finger rested on the trigger. Professional grip, controlled breathing. Everything about her posture suggested capability and willingness, and the kind of commitment that came from people who had decided action was necessary and consequences were acceptable. Flynn continued, voice steady, no pleading. Just facts delivered with the certainty of someone who had nothing to lose because losing meant the same outcome as surrendering. General Carson Vega approved weapons transfers to Taliban elements. He used those weapons to set an ambush that killed your brother and 5 others. He framed Luis by making it look like Luis was running the trafficking, when actually Luis discovered it and was trying to stop it. Luis died running toward Ryan Brennan when I couldn't reach him because Gunnery Sergeant Hale pulled me away to save the rest of the team. Vic's expression flickered. Not belief, not trust. Just the smallest crack in certainty that suggested Flynn's words had landed somewhere truth and vendetta intersected. Prove it. Flynn gestured slowly toward her vest. Pocket, left side, encrypted drive. Contains photographs from Syria Weapons Depot. Shipping manifests, transfer authorizations signed by Vega and Luis. Timeline that shows Luis was investigating before he died. Chain of custody showing weapons recovered from Taliban, then diverted again through Captain Diaz. Everything you need to know your brother wasn't a criminal. He was trying to stop criminals and they killed him for it. Vic considered. Calculations happening behind eyes that had seen enough lies to recognize truth when it arrived wearing uncomfortable clothes and demanding attention it hadn't earned. Take the drive out, slowly, 2 fingers. Anything else comes out of that pocket, I shoot first and check your corpse for evidence second. Flynn complied. Remove the encrypted drive, set it on the table between them. Step back, hands visible again, non-threatening. The posture of someone offering information instead of fighting for freedom. Vic moved forward, picked up the drive, her weapon never wavering. Professional, disciplined, everything Flynn would expect from someone trained well and motivated personally. This better be what you say it is, because if you're lying, if this is some operational deception, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cell so deep they'll forget you exist. Look at it, check the metadata, verify the signatures, then decide whether you want to arrest the person trying to expose treason or help them finish what your brother started. Vic backed toward the door, weapon still aimed. You stay here, you move, I shoot. Clear? Flynn nodded. Vic disappeared into the hallway. Flynn heard her moving to another room. Heard computer boot up. Heard the silence that came when people were processing information that challenged everything they believed. 5 minutes passed, long enough for Flynn to escape through the window and disappear into Montana night. Long enough to abort and extract and let someone else finish what she started. She stayed. Because running now meant Vic would spend the rest of her life believing Flynn was guilty. Meant Luis Torres would be remembered as traitor instead of hero. Meant 6 Marines died for nothing, and their sacrifice meant nothing, and all the effort Flynn had invested in honoring Hale's philosophy meant nothing. Vic returned. Her weapon was holstered. Her expression had shifted from hostile to something more complicated. Grief and anger and the kind of confusion that came from discovering your enemy was actually your ally, and your understanding of the past 2 years was built on foundations that just collapsed. The metadata checks out. The signatures are genuine. The timeline matches what Luis told me in his last call before Syria. He said he found something big, something dangerous. I thought he was being paranoid. I thought combat stress was making him see conspiracies where there were just mistakes. Flynn said nothing. Let Vic process. Let her arrive at conclusions Flynn couldn't force without triggering resistance that would undo everything. Vega killed my brother. Yes, and you've been trying to prove it. For 2 years, since the day I survived, and they didn't. Vic walked to the window, looked out at Montana night that had grown colder while they talked. Her shoulders carried weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. The weight of knowing truth and understanding it changed obligations in ways that couldn't be ignored. Arlington, Veterans Day, 3 days from now. That's where we expose him. Public ceremony, cameras, witnesses who will ask questions when decorated general gets accused of treason by people who have evidence too detailed to dismiss. Vic turned, met Flynn's eyes. FBI raids your compound in 12 hours, maybe less. You'll be in custody before you get anywhere near Arlington. Unless FBI has reasons to delay. Reasons like new intelligence suggesting the raid would compromise a larger investigation. Reasons like an agent who tells her superiors the case is more complicated than they realize, and rushing it would let the real criminals escape. Understanding crossed Vic's face. You want me to slow down my own investigation, to give you time to get to Arlington. To trust you even though every protocol says I should arrest you right now. I want you to get justice for Luis, real justice. Not the kind that comes from arresting foot soldiers while generals walk free. The kind that holds people accountable, regardless of rank or connections or the power they have to bury evidence. Vic was quiet, long enough that Flynn wondered if the ask was too much. If personal connection wasn't strong enough to overcome institutional loyalty and career preservation, and all the rational reasons why helping Flynn was bad decision. Finally, Vic spoke. I can delay the raid, maybe 24 hours. I tell my SAC that we have intelligence suggesting coalition members have fled to secondary locations. That raiding the compound now would net small fish while big ones escape. That we need time to coordinate with other field offices. That works, but I'm going with you to Arlington. I'm not trusting you to handle this alone. Luis deserves family present when his name gets cleared. And if you're lying, if any of this is deception, I will personally ensure you never see daylight again. Flynn extended her hand. Deal. Vic took it. The handshake was firm, professional, the kind that sealed agreements between people who didn't fully trust each other, but trusted their objectives aligned closely enough to make cooperation more valuable than opposition. They left the FBI office separately. Vic through the front, Flynn through the window she had entered, both understanding they had just formed alliance that violated protocols and regulations and probably laws, but served justice in ways that following rules never would. Flynn drove back toward Montana. The roads were empty, small towns dark. America sleeping while she navigated terrain that was about to get more complicated because Vic's involvement meant additional variables, and Flynn's operations depended on controlling variables that couldn't be controlled when other people with their own agendas became part of equations that were already approaching unsolvable. Her encrypted phone vibrated. Message from Brennan. FBI delayed raid, reason unknown. We have breathing room. What happened? Flynn typed response. Made contact with the lead investigator. Showed evidence. She's with us now. Complication, but useful complication. Brennan's response was immediate. Can we trust her? Flynn thought about Vic, about the grief in her eyes when she realized her brother died a hero, about the determination that came from people who valued truth over comfort and justice over career. Yes, she's motivated by same thing we are, different approach, same objective. Then we proceed to Arlington. Flynn arrived at the compound 3 hours before dawn. The members had returned from their false evacuation. The vehicles were staged for actual departure. Everything prepared for the moment when deception ended and real movement began. Brennan met her at the gate. His expression was tired but determined. The look of someone who had spent 2 years grieving and was finally close enough to answers that exhaustion mattered less than completion. Vic Shelton is Luis Torres' sister, Flynn told him. She's been hunting me because she thinks I'm responsible for his death. I showed her evidence. She understands now. She's delaying FBI raid, giving us time to reach Arlington. Brennan absorbed the information. Processed implications. Family makes people unpredictable, makes them emotional, makes them take risks that logic says they shouldn't take. Family also makes people committed, makes them see things through when rational people would quit. We need commitment more than we need predictability. What's our timeline? Arlington ceremony is November 11th, Veterans Day, 2 days from now. We need to be positioned by the 10th. Need to coordinate with Vic. Need to plan approach that doesn't trigger Secret Service or military police or the security apparatus that will be protecting a general officer at a national cemetery. Brennan pulled out a tablet, showed Flynn satellite imagery of Arlington, the amphitheater where ceremonies occurred, the surrounding terrain, the approaches that would be monitored and the ones that might not be because security assumed threats came from outside instead of inside the ceremony itself. They planned through the night, routes, timing, equipment, the coordination that separated successful operations from disasters that ended careers and lives and missions that mattered. Dawn arrived. Montana morning painted in colors that would have been beautiful if Flynn had time to notice beauty, instead of focusing on details that would determine whether 6 Marines got justice or remained casualties in wars most Americans would never know were fought. Her phone buzzed. Vic. Raid delayed 48 hours. My SAC bought the story, but the clock is running. After 48 hours, tactical teams deploy regardless of my objections. You need to be at Arlington before then, or this opportunity closes. Flynn typed back. Understood, moving to position today. We'll coordinate when we arrive. She showed the message to Brennan. Time to move, Johnny said. For real this time. We take what we need, leave what we don't. We drive to Arlington, we prepare, we expose Vega, and we make sure Ryan and Luis and the others didn't die for nothing. The convoy assembled. Smaller this time. 10 people. Flynn and Brennan and 8 members who had earned trust through years of shared experience and shared values and the kind of bonds that came from people who had served together and understood what service cost. Derek Nash was among them, still suspicious, still watching Flynn, but committed to the mission because his loyalty to Brennan outweighed his distrust of the woman who appeared too skilled and too capable and too mysterious to be what she claimed. They departed at noon, drove east, through Montana into Wyoming, through Wyoming into Nebraska, long miles on highways that connected rural America to itself. Towns that existed because interstates needed gas stations and gas stations needed customers, and customers needed places to sleep between departure and destination. Flynn drove lead vehicle, Brennan beside her. The silence between them was comfortable. The kind that came from people who had moved past small talk into the territory where words were optional because understanding was mutual. What happens after Arlington? Brennan asked as Nebraska planes scrolled past. After Arlington, we give evidence to people who can use it. DOD Inspector General, congressional oversight, maybe media if official channels prove as corrupt as the system we're exposing. We make enough noise that burying it becomes harder than admitting it. And you? What happens to you? Flynn thought about that, about the 2 years she had spent in shadows, about the missions that couldn't be discussed and the identity that officially didn't exist, about the choice between returning to official status and remaining in spaces where she was most effective because bureaucracy hadn't found her yet. I don't know. That depends on whether the people I work for decide I'm asset or liability. Depends on whether exposure helps their objectives or compromises them. Depends on variables I can't control. You could stay with us, with the coalition. We could use someone with your skills. Flynn smiled. Small, sad, tempting, but I'm not a joiner, Colonel. I work better alone. Or in small teams where everyone understands the mission matters more than individuals completing it. They drove through the afternoon, stopped briefly for fuel and food that tasted like cardboard, but provided calories that mattered more than flavor. Resumed driving as sun dropped toward horizon and painted plains and shades that reminded Flynn of deployments where terrain was beautiful and missions were ugly, and the contradiction made both more intense. Somewhere in Iowa, Flynn's phone buzzing, encrypted message, not from Vic, from her handlers, the people who had been demanding abort and offering extraction and making promises about support that never materialized when support was needed. Intelligence indicates General Vaga aware of investigation. He has requested additional security for Arlington ceremony. Threat level elevated. Recommend immediate abort. Extraction available. This is final offer. Flynn read the message twice. Vega knew, which meant someone had tipped him, which meant the conspiracy went deeper than one general and a few corrupt logistics officers, which meant exposing Vega might trigger responses Flynn couldn't predict and couldn't prepare for because preparation required knowing threats, and she was operating in darkness that was getting darker. She deleted the message. Brennan noticed. Problem? Vega knows we're coming. He's increased security, which means our approach needs to be more careful than planned. Can we still do it? Flynn thought about Hale, about the lessons he taught, about competence creating options and excellence creating options that didn't exist until you made them exist. About the question every operator had to answer before executing plans that might not survive contact with reality. Is this action necessary? Yes, she said. We can still do it. Just costs more than it would have if we had surprise on our side. They drove through the night, taking turns behind the wheel, sleeping in shifts. The kind of road discipline that came from people who had done long movements before and understood that arrival mattered more than comfort during transit. Virginia appeared as dawn broke. The landscape shifted from plains to hills, from rural to suburban, from spaces between to spaces that connected everything Americans thought about when they thought about government and power and the machinery that ran the country most of them would never fully understand. Arlington National Cemetery occupied land that had been Lee's plantation before the Civil War, taught Americans that some causes weren't worth dying for regardless of how honorably you fought. Now it held the honored dead, row after row of white headstones marking graves that held bodies that had held lives that mattered to families and friends in the nation they served. Flynn had been here once, for Hale's funeral, the ceremony where they buried the man who saved her life and destroyed his career and died 4 months later from stress that people called natural causes. But Flynn knew was assassination by bureaucratic means. She would return for the ceremony that would either vindicate him or end the same way his life ended, in classification and silence, and the kind of forgetting that was policy instead of accident. They positioned in a hotel 3 miles from Arlington, close enough to reach quickly, far enough to avoid security sweeps that would intensify as the ceremony approached. Flynn coordinated with Vic through encrypted channels, meeting points, timing, the synchronization that would be critical when everything happened fast and second chances didn't exist. November 10th, one day before the ceremony, Flynn walked Arlington grounds with Brennan. They moved like tourists, cameras, interest in headstones, the kind of casual observation that looked innocent, but was actually reconnaissance that mapped security positions and identified approaches and calculated fields of fire for scenarios Flynn hoped wouldn't occur, but prepared for anyway. The amphitheater sat in a natural bowl, seating for 2,000, stage for dignitaries, security that was visible and invisible, Secret Service for the vice president who would attend, military police for the general officers, Capitol Police for the politicians who would speak about sacrifice they had never personally risked. Vega would be on stage, protected, surrounded by people whose job was preventing exactly what Flynn and Brennan planned to attempt. They returned to the hotel. Brennan's team had assembled equipment, nothing illegal, nothing that would trigger security if searched, but everything necessary for what came next. Flynn's phone buzzed. Vic, tomorrow, noon ceremony. I'll be positioned near the stage, east side. Security credential gets me close. You will have maybe 60 seconds when Vega finishes his speech and security is transitioning. That's your window. Use it. Flynn showed the message to Brennan. 60 seconds, not much time. It's enough. Has to be enough. They spent the evening reviewing plans, contingencies, abort criteria, the kind of detailed preparation that separated successful operations from tragedies that became case studies about what not to do. Flynn slept poorly. Dreams of Syria, of faces that wouldn't age because aging required living, and living required surviving, and survival required luck. She had, but they hadn't. Dawn arrived. November 11th, Veterans Day. The day Americans remembered sacrifice and honor, and the debt owed to people who served, even though most Americans would spend the day shopping sales instead of visiting graves. Flynn dressed carefully. Business casual. Nothing tactical. Nothing that would read as threat to security screening, that would be thorough and professional, and looking for exactly the kind of person Flynn used to be before Syria taught her that being invisible mattered more than being impressive. Brennan wore suit and tie, Marine Corps pin on lapel, the look of veteran attending ceremony honoring service. Legitimate. Expected. The kind of cover that worked because it was true, even if the purpose underneath wasn't what it appeared. They arrived at Arlington 2 hours before the ceremony, early enough to pass through security without the rush that would come when attendance peaked, late enough to avoid being so early that security paid special attention. Security was thorough but not invasive. Metal detectors, bag checks, credential verification, everything standard for events where important people gathered and threats were assumed until proven otherwise. Flynn and Brennan passed through, found seats in the amphitheater, middle section, good sight lines to the stage, close enough to matter, far enough to avoid obvious scrutiny. The amphitheater filled, 2,000 people, veterans in uniform and suits, families who remembered, citizens who cared enough to attend even though attendance meant sacrifice of time and comfort and the easier option of staying home. Dignitaries arrived, senators, representatives, military brass wearing more ribbons than most people earned in full careers, the vice president with his security detail and his prepared remarks and his political awareness that veterans were constituency worth courting in election years. Then Vega appeared. Brigadier General Carson Vega, 56 years old, decorated, respected, the kind of career officer who had checked every box and climbed every ladder, and positioned himself for further advancement because ambition was currency in systems that rewarded ambition over integrity. He took the stage, smiled, waved, the performance of humility by someone who had spent decades learning how to look humble while accumulating power that made humility irrelevant. The ceremony began. Speeches, songs, the rituals that Americans performed when remembering sacrifice they mostly ignored until one day a year when ignorance became politically inconvenient. Vega's turn came. He stood at the podium, spoke about honor, about duty, about the brave men and women who gave their lives so others could live free. The irony was so thick, Flynn could taste it. This man talking about sacrifice while profiting from the deaths of people who actually made sacrifices he only performed. Flynn's hands clenched. Brennan beside her sat motionless, controlled. But she could feel the tension radiating from him. The rage contained because containing it was necessary until the moment when release was tactical instead of emotional. Vega concluded his speech. Applause, polite, respectful. The kind Americans gave to generals and politicians, regardless of whether respect was earned or performed. Security began transitioning. Movement on stage. Dignitaries preparing to exit. Secret Service repositioning. The moment of controlled chaos that happened during every event when official program ended and informal departures began. 60 seconds, Vic had said. That was the window. Flynn stood, Brennan beside her. They moved down the aisle, not running, not drawing attention. Just two veterans approaching the stage with the confidence of people who belonged because they had served, and this was their ceremony as much as anyone's. Security noticed, but didn't intervene. Not yet. Not until Flynn and Brennan reached the stage barrier where credentials were required and purpose had to be stated and legitimate access separated from unauthorized approach. Vic appeared, FBI credential visible. She spoke to the security officer, pointed to Flynn and Brennan, said something that made the officer nod and step aside. Flynn and Brennan climbed onto the stage. Vega saw them. His expression shifted from political smile to confusion, to recognition, to fear, as everything he had buried for 2 years walked toward him with evidence he couldn't deny and witnesses he couldn't silence. The amphitheater went quiet. 2,000 people watching two veterans approach a general who suddenly looked smaller than his rank suggested. Brennan spoke. His voice carried, amplified by the microphone Vega had just used to deliver lies about honor. General Vega, my name is Colonel Marcus Brennan, United States Marine Corps retired. My son was Captain Ryan Brennan. He died in Syria March 2019, along with Captain Luis Torres and 4 others during an operation you approved and then betrayed. Security moved, but Vic blocked them, FBI authority trumping military police in the moment of confusion about jurisdiction and protocol. Vega raised his hands, placating. Colonel Brennan, I understand your grief, but this is neither the time nor the place. This is exactly the time and place. You stand here talking about sacrifice while hiding the fact that you profited from the deaths of the people you sent into ambush. You approved weapons transfers to Taliban elements. You used those weapons to kill 6 Marines who trusted you. You framed Luis Torres to cover your crimes. And you've spent 2 years living free while families grieve the sons you murdered. The amphitheater erupted, gasps, shouting, camera phones emerging because this was America and spectacle mattered more than decorum, and everyone wanted evidence they witnessed history even if history was ugly. Vega tried to speak, to deny, to maintain the fiction that had protected him. But Brennan pulled documents from his jacket, the manifest, the transfer authorizations, the signatures that proved everything. Your signature, General, on transfers that went to enemy forces. Transfers that armed the people who killed my son. Explain that. Explain it to these people. Explain it to the families. Explain it to the nation you betrayed. Vega's facade cracked. Fear replaced confidence. The look of someone who realized the walls closing in and escape routes disappearing. Security finally moved with purpose. Surrounded Brennan and Flynn, weapons drawn, commands shouted, the machinery of force deployment that happened when situations exceeded protocol and training defaulted to control through presence. But they were too late. The damage was done. 2,000 witnesses, cameras recording, media present, the kind of exposure that couldn't be buried under classification because classification couldn't erase video that was already uploading to platforms designed to spread information faster than authorities could contain it. Vic stepped forward. FBI credential raised. Federal agents, stand down. These individuals are witnesses in an ongoing investigation. General Vega, you need to come with me for questioning regarding allegations of weapons trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder. The vice president's security detail moved him off stage. The ceremony had ended, not the way it was planned, not with respect and dignity and the comfortable rituals that let Americans feel patriotic without confronting uncomfortable truths, but with truth, raw, ugly, necessary. Flynn watched Vega being led away, watched security processing Brennan, watched media swarming for statements and explanations and the details that would fill news cycles for weeks and hopefully force investigations that couldn't be buried. Her encrypted phone vibrated. Final message from her handlers. Exposure complete. Mission accomplished. Extraction authorized. Well done, Master Chief. Flynn deleted the message. She didn't need extraction, didn't need their approval or their congratulations or their validation that came too late to matter. What she needed was standing 30 feet away being interviewed by reporters who would tell Ryan's story and Luis's story, and the stories of 4 others who died in darkness and deserved to be remembered in light. Vic appeared beside Flynn. That went better than expected. Also worse, we'll be answering questions for weeks. Justice is complicated, would be suspicious if it was easy. They walked away from the chaos, away from the cameras and the crowds and the machinery of exposure that would grind through evidence and testimony and hopefully produce accountability instead of the cover-ups that had protected Vega for 2 years. Arlington was quiet beyond the amphitheater, just graves and memories and the weight of sacrifice that Americans acknowledged one day a year and forgot the other 364. Flynn found Hale's grave, the headstone that marked where they buried the man who taught her everything that mattered and died knowing his lessons would live through the operator he trained. She knelt, placed her hand on the cold stone, spoke quietly to a man who couldn't hear, but might understand anyway if understanding transcended death and physics and the boundaries that separated living from gone. 0 necessary kills, Gunny, just like you taught me. 6 honored, 1 teaching, mission complete. The stone was silent, but somewhere in Montana wind or Syrian sand or whatever space existed between living and remembering, Flynn imagined Hale smiled and nodded and approved of the woman she had become by honoring the philosophy he died protecting. She stood, walked toward where Vic and Brennan waited, toward questions that would be asked and answers that would be given in the long process of turning exposure into justice that mattered more than exposure itself. The dead had taught to the living. Now the living would make sure the teaching continued until honor meant something more than speeches and sacrifice meant something more than words and accountability applied to everyone regardless of rank or power or the comfortable lies that made betrayal possible. Flynn had 48 hours to do what seemed impossible. She had done it, not perfectly, not without cost, but done it nonetheless with 0 casualties and maximum truth and the kind of outcome that would make Hale proud if pride was something ghosts could feel. The rest was paperwork and testimony and the grinding machinery of justice. That was someone else's fight now. Flynn had kept her promise, had honored the 6 who didn't survive, had proven that 0 necessary kills was philosophy that worked when competence met commitment and excellence met opportunity. The war wasn't over. Wars never were, but this battle was won. And sometimes winning one battle was enough to justify continuing the war that would never end, because betrayal was human nature. And fighting it required eternal vigilance, and the willingness to pay prices that comfort made people forget mattered. Flynn walked into November afternoon, into whatever came next, into the future she had earned by refusing to accept that survival required killing when competence created options that killing eliminated. Somewhere behind her, Arlington held the graves of people who understood that truth. Somewhere ahead, missions waited that would test whether that truth survived contact with realities that made truth complicated and necessary and worth defending regardless of cost. She was ready, had always been ready, would remain ready until ready wasn't enough and something else was required, and she discovered what that something else might be. But not today. Today was for remembering, for honoring, for proving that the ones we couldn't save had saved us anyway through lessons they taught and legacies they left and the expectations they held that we would be worthy of their sacrifice. Flynn intended to remain worthy, no matter what that required, no matter how long it took, no matter who stood in the way of honoring people who deserved honor more than the ones currently receiving it. That was the promise. That was the mission. That was the only thing that mattered when everything else fell away and you stood alone with choices that defined who you were instead of who you claimed to be. And Cara Flynn knew exactly who she was, exactly what she owed, exactly how she would pay it. 0 necessary kills, 6 honored, 1 teaching, always. The camera stopped rolling 3 hours after Vega was led away from Arlington in handcuffs that looked too small for a brigadier general, but fit perfectly for a traitor. The amphitheater emptied, 2,000 witnesses dispersed to homes and hotels and lives that would continue while the machinery of justice ground forward with the speed of institutions that prioritize process over urgency. Flynn sat on a bench overlooking the graves. row after row of white headstones marching toward horizon in formations more perfect than any living unit could achieve. The irony wasn't lost on her. Death organized what life made chaotic, made equals of people who spent their breathing years divided by rank and race and all the classifications that mattered until they stopped mattering because dirt didn't care about distinctions. Brennan found her as sunset painted Arlington in shades that made everything look softer than it was. He moved slower than he had 3 days ago. The adrenaline had burned off. What remained was exhaustion and grief and the particular emptiness that came after you achieved objective you had pursued for 2 years and discovered achievement didn't fill the holes loss had carved. They want statements, he said. FBI, DOD Inspector General, Congressional Oversight Committee. Everyone who ignored this for 2 years suddenly wants to know everything about it. Flynn didn't look away from the graves. You'll give them statements. Tell them everything. Hold nothing back. Truth is only weapon we have now that exposure is complete. What about you? They're asking for you specifically. Want to know how a Marine who's been officially dead for 2 years managed to infiltrate militia compound and expose general officer conspiracy. Let them ask. I'll answer when lawyers finish arguing about jurisdiction and classification levels and whether my testimony requires presidential authorization to hear. Brennan sat beside her. His shoulder almost touched hers. The proximity of people who had shared foxholes and understood that some experiences created bonds that didn't require words to maintain. Thank you, he said quietly. For proving Ryan to the hero instead of a casualty of trafficking, I couldn't stop. For giving me answers when everyone else gave me lies dressed as classified necessity. Flynn turned to look at him, saw the father instead of the colonel, saw the grief that would never fully heal, but might scar over enough to let him function. Saw the man who had lost everything that mattered and somehow found reason to keep going because going was what you did when stopping meant betraying the people who couldn't go anymore. Ryan earned his death, Colonel. Earned it by being exactly who you raised him to be. That's not comfort, I know, but it's truth, and truth is all I can give you. They sat in silence while Arlington darkened and lights activated along pathways that guided visitors who came to remember people they had known when those people were problems, and promises instead of headstones and memories. Flynn's phone vibrated. Text from Vic. DOJ wants you for testimony tomorrow. 900. Federal building. Bring lawyer if you have one. If not, they'll provide. This is real Flynn. They're building case. Flynn showed the message to Brennan. He read it, nodded. Good, let them build case. Let them do what they should have done 2 years ago when Torres first reported discrepancies in weapons inventory. Torres reported it? Flynn's attention sharpened. I didn't know that. Thought he was investigating quietly. He reported it through channels. Filed official complaint with his commanding officer. That CO was Captain Marcus Diaz, Pentagon Logistics, Syria Theater Operations. Same officer who signed off on Javelin transfers after Vega approved them. Flynn felt ice form in her chest. The kind that came when puzzle pieces aligned and revealed picture uglier than expected. Diaz. Pentagon Logistics. Position that gave him access to transfer authorizations and shipping manifests in the machinery that moved weapons from depots to war zones to wherever profits dictated instead of strategic necessity. Diaz is still active duty? Was, last I checked, Arlington Logistics Coordinator. Handles ceremonies and memorial coordination. Brennan's voice went flat. Handles this cemetery. Has access to security protocols and visitor logs and everything needed to know who's coming and when and how to position assets if assets needed positioning. The ice spread. Flynn stood. Scanned the cemetery. Darkness had fallen completely now. Streetlights created pools of illumination separated by shadows deep enough to hide threats until threats were close enough that hiding didn't matter anymore. We need to leave, now. If Diaz knows we exposed Vega and he's part of the same network, then we're targets. Loose ends that need tying before testimony happens, and cases get built and networks get rolled up. Brennan rose. His hand moved toward the pistol Flynn knew he carried. The habit of men who had carried weapons so long that being unarmed felt like being naked. You think he'd move on us here? In Arlington? With FBI and media and whole world watching? I think desperate people do desperate things. And Diaz just watched his conspiracy partner get arrested on national television. Desperate doesn't begin to describe what he's feeling. They walked toward the parking lot, fast but not running. The pace that suggested purpose without panic. Flynn's awareness expanded, cataloging movement, sounds, the details that separated normal cemetery activity from abnormal patterns that preceded violence. A car sat in the lot that hadn't been there an hour ago. Dark sedan, government plates, engine running despite nobody visible inside. The kind of detail that could mean nothing or could mean everything, depending on whether paranoia was justified or just trauma making you see threats everywhere. Flynn pulled Brennan behind a maintenance building, concrete walls, good cover, limited sightlines, but also limited exposure. The trade-offs you made when choosing between seeing threats and being seen by them. That car, she whispered, government plates, engine running, nobody inside that we can see. Brennan pulled his phone, photographed the plates, ran them through database access he apparently still had despite being retired. His expression went hard. Registered to Pentagon Motor Pool, checked out 4 hours ago to Captain Marcus Diaz. Flynn's training activated. Threat assessment, exit routes, defensive positions if defense became necessary. He's here, watching, waiting for a moment when we're exposed and he can eliminate witnesses before we testify. Or he's just here doing his job, coordinating memorial services, being exactly where he's supposed to be. You believe that? Brennan shook his head. No, but I want to. Want to believe not everyone I trusted betrayed me. Flynn understood the impulse. The desire for simple narratives where betrayal was limited and justice was straightforward, and trust didn't require the kind of verification that made relationships impossible. But Syria had taught her that simple narratives were comfortable lies, and complicated truth was the only thing worth trusting. Call Vic. Tell her Diaz is here. Tell her we need FBI presence before this turns into something that can't be walked back. Brennan made the call, spoke quietly, urgent but controlled, the voice of someone reporting contact instead of requesting rescue. Flynn respected that, respected the understanding that you handled threats yourself until handling required resources you didn't have. He hung up. Vic's 20 minutes out. Says we should secure position and wait. Says not to engage unless engaged first. 20 minutes is eternity in tactical time. He could. Movement stopped her mid-sentence. Figure emerging from shadows near Vega's car. Male, 6 feet, military bearing even in civilian clothes. Captain Marcus Diaz, 42 years old, decorated logistics officer. Partner in conspiracy that had killed 6 Marines and would kill more if given opportunity. He walked toward the maintenance building. Not hurried, not casual. The pace of someone who knew where targets were and didn't need to rush because targets weren't going anywhere. Flynn pulled her pistol. Glock 19, 17 rounds. Suppressor that reduced reported enough to avoid immediate attention from security patrols that were probably too far away to respond fast anyway. Brennan had his weapon out too. Kimber 1911, 45 caliber, 7 rounds. The kind of pistol Marines loved because stopping power mattered more than capacity when you believed in accuracy and training and the philosophy that every shot should count. Diaz stopped 30 feet from their position, close enough to be heard, too far to rush without giving them time to respond. The distance that suggested he understood they were armed and prepared and not targets he could eliminate without risk. Colonel Brennan, Master Chief Flynn. His voice carried easily in the quiet. Professional, almost friendly. The tone of someone discussing weather instead of conspiracy. I thought I might find you here, paying respects, making plans, preparing for testimony that will destroy careers and lives and operations you don't fully understand. Flynn kept her weapon aimed center mass. Surrender, Diaz. FBI is en route. You're done. Network is exposed. Running just makes it worse. Diaz smiled. Small. Sad. Running? I'm not running. I'm here to ensure certain facts remain classified. Certain people remain protected. Certain truths stay buried because exposing them does more harm than hiding them ever could. 6 Marines died because you and Vega sold weapons to Taliban. Brennan's voice was cold. Controlled. The kind of cold that came from rage frozen solid because expressing it would compromise mission discipline. You call that classified necessity? You call murder protective policy? I call it acceptable losses in service of larger strategic objectives. The weapons sales funded operations you'll never know about. Operations that saved American lives, prevented attacks, maintained access to intelligence networks that keep this country safe. 6 Marines died so hundreds didn't. That's the math. Terrible math. But math that someone has to calculate because refusing to calculate it means more people die. Flynn had heard this argument before. From intelligence officers who believed ends justified means. From politicians who traded principles for expedience. From people who convinced themselves that betrayal became patriotism if you betrayed the right people for the right reasons. She had never believed it, never accepted that some lives were worth less than others, or that calculating acceptable losses was anything except moral cowardice dressed as strategic necessity. Luis Torres reported the weapons discrepancy to you, Flynn said. He trusted you to investigate. You killed him to protect yourself. I killed no one. Torres died in ambush we couldn't prevent because intelligence is imperfect and war is chaos, and sometimes good men die despite our best efforts. You set the ambush. You gave Taliban the mission parameters. You murdered 6 Marines to silence witnesses. Diaz's expression hardened. Prove it. You have manifests and signatures and evidence that shows weapons move through channels I supervised. But proving I deliberately caused those deaths requires intent you can't demonstrate, requires access to classified communications you'll never see, requires cooperation from people who will never cooperate because doing so destroys their careers along with mine. He was right. Flynn knew he was right. Evidence of transfers wasn't evidence of murder. Signatures weren't confessions. The gap between knowing someone was guilty and proving it in court was wide enough that guilty people walked free every day, while knowing people watched them walk and could do nothing except carry the weight of knowing truth while living with injustice. But Flynn hadn't spent 2 years building this case to watch it collapse because burden of proof protected criminals better than it protected victims. Vega will testify, she said. He'll give you up to reduce his sentence. He'll provide documentation that proves intent and coordination and everything needed to convict you. Diaz laughed. Genuine amusement. Vega won't testify. Vega knows what happens to people who testify against networks that stretch higher than brigadier generals. He'll take his court-martial and his prison sentence and his silence because silence keeps him alive, and testimony gets him killed in accidents that look natural until someone investigates and discovers investigation was discouraged by people with authority to discourage effectively. Flynn's finger tightened on the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. The line between conversation and violence. Between letting Diaz walk away and ensuring he never walked anywhere again. The question Hale taught her arrived right on schedule. Is this kill necessary? Before she could answer, movement in the shadows behind Diaz revealed 3 more figures. Contractors, probably. The kind that did work government couldn't officially sanction. Armed, professional, the escalation from conversation to combat that happened when talking failed and violence became inevitable. Brennan saw them too. We're outnumbered, 4-2, poor odds even for Marines. 5-2, Vic Shelton's voice came from behind them. She emerged from different shadows with her weapon drawn and 2 FBI agents flanking her. And those odds just improved significantly. Diaz's confidence flickered. Calculation happening behind eyes that had spent career assessing risk versus reward. 3 contractors and himself against 2 Marines and 3 FBI agents. Numbers favored him slightly, but tactical situation didn't. FBI had authority, had backup en route, had the kind of institutional weight that made shooting federal agents career-ending, even for people whose careers were already destroyed. Agent Shelton, Diaz said carefully, this is misunderstanding. I'm here coordinating memorial services. These 2 approached me. I was attempting to de-escalate situation that seemed potentially volatile. Save it, Vic said. I've been listening for the last 5 minutes. Recorded everything. Your admission about acceptable losses. Your threat about testimony. Your implied coordination with Vega. That's confession enough to hold you while we build the rest. The contractor shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Flynn tracked the movement, calculated engagement sequences. Who to shoot first? How many rounds before they responded? The tactical math that happened automatically when violence became possibility instead of hypothetical. Stand down, Vic ordered. You're contractors, not soldiers. This isn't your fight. Walk away now and you avoid federal charges. Stay and you're accomplices to murder. The contractors looked at Diaz, waiting for orders, waiting for the go signal that would turn Arlington National Cemetery into battlefield that would dishonor every grave it held. Diaz raised his hands slowly. Stand down. All of you, this isn't the time or place. The contractors retreated, melted into shadows they emerged from. Gone but not far, waiting, ready to engage if circumstances changed and engagement became necessary. Vic moved forward, weapon still aimed at Diaz. Captain Marcus Diaz, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and about 6 other charges I'll think of while you're being processed. You have the right to remain silent. She continued the Miranda warning while her agent secured Diaz, cuffed him, led him toward vehicles that had arrived during the confrontation. FBI response that had been positioned and ready because Vic had learned from Flynn that preparation mattered more than improvisation when operations could go wrong in seconds. Flynn lowered her weapon, safed it, holstered it. The adrenaline still pumped, but training contained it, channeled it into awareness instead of action, into readiness instead of reaction. Brennan did the same. His hands trembled slightly. Not fear, just the physical response to stress that even experienced operators couldn't fully control when stress reached levels that triggered autonomic responses despite training. Close, he said, too close. 0 casualties, Flynn replied, just like Hale taught. Could have shot all 4. Chose not to. Found different solution. That's the whole point. Vic returned after Diaz was secured. Her expression was complicated. Relief and frustration mixed with something that might have been respect, or might have been the acknowledgement that Flynn's methods worked even when they violated everything FBI training taught about controlling situations through overwhelming force. That was reckless, Vic said. Confronting him alone, no backup, no coordination. You could have both died, and we'd have lost witnesses we need for prosecution. We had you, Flynn said. Knew you'd arrive. Knew you'd be listening. Knew you'd position for exactly what happened. How did you know that? Because that's what I would do. And you're good enough to think like I think. Good enough to anticipate instead of react. Good enough that trusting you was tactical instead of emotional. Vic studied Flynn. Testimony starts tomorrow. DOJ, Congressional Committee, Inspector General. Everyone wants their piece of this. You ready for that? Ready to spend weeks answering questions about operations that were supposed to stay classified? Flynn thought about the question, about the implications of testimony, about the exposure it would bring and the complications that came from being officially alive after 2 years of being officially dead, about the career that waited if she wanted it and the alternative that existed if she didn't. Ready as I'll ever be, she said. She said finally. Truth is only weapon left. Might as well use it. They walked toward the parking lot, toward vehicles and lives and futures that had become uncertain the moment exposure happened, and certainty became luxury nobody could afford. Flynn's phone buzzed. Message from encrypted channel she hadn't used since Syria, the kind that connected to people who operated in spaces most Americans didn't know existed. Testimony approved. Full disclosure authorized. Classification protections waived for Syria operation and related activities. You are cleared to speak freely. This is unprecedented authorization. Use it well. She showed the message to Vic and Brennan. Brennan whistled low. They're letting you tell everything. No redactions, no classifications, complete transparency. They're cutting loose everyone involved, Flynn corrected. Letting me burn the network because network became liability instead of asset. This isn't justice. This is house cleaning. Does it matter? Vic asked. If the outcome is same, if guilty people face consequences, regardless of whether consequences come from justice or expedience? Flynn considered the question, thought about Hale, about what he would say, about the distinction between right actions for right reasons and right actions for wrong reasons, and whether outcomes mattered more than motivations. It matters, she said finally, because motivations determine whether this happens again. If they're allowing testimony because it serves them, then they'll block testimony when blocking serves them. Justice can't be selective, can't depend on whether powerful people find it convenient. They reach their vehicles, separated with promises to meet before testimony, to coordinate, to ensure stories aligned and evidence-supported claims, and the machinery of prosecution had everything needed to succeed. Flynn drove alone to a hotel where Brennan's team waited. The coalition members who had come to Arlington and stayed because loyalty meant finishing what you started, even when starting, led places you hadn't anticipated. Derek Nash met her in the parking lot. His expression was different than it had been in Montana, less suspicious, more something that might have been respect, or might have been the acknowledgement that his paranoia had been wrong about her identity, but right about her importance. News is everywhere, he said. Video of Brennan confronting Vega. Your face is all over social media. People are asking questions, who you are, what you did, why you were dead for 2 years. Let them ask. Truth is coming whether they're ready for it or not. Some in the coalition are nervous, worried about blowback, worried FBI investigation expands to include everyone who was in compound when you were there. Flynn understood the concern, understood that exposure brought scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed things people preferred hidden. Tell them the investigation is focused on Vega and Diaz and the network that used them. Tell them cooperation brings protection. Tell them truth is defense when truth is documented and provable. Nash nodded, started to leave, stopped, turned back. I was wrong about you, about who you were and what you wanted, for what it's worth. It's worth something. Not everything, but something. He left. Flynn entered her room, small, functional, the kind that hotels near Arlington provided for people visiting graves instead of tourist attractions. She locked the door, drew blinds, sat on bed that was too soft after weeks of Montana barracks bunks and vehicle seats and the other uncomfortable places operators slept, when comfort was luxury and mission was necessity. Sleep didn't come. Too much adrenaline still in her system. Too many thoughts competing for attention. Too many questions about what came after testimony and consequences, and the resolution that was beginning, but wouldn't conclude for months or years, or however long justice required, when justice involved institutions that moved slower than glaciers and protected themselves better than they protected the people they were supposed to serve. Her phone rang. Not encrypted channel, regular call, number she recognized even though it had been 2 years since she'd seen it. She answered. Gunny. Wade Hale's voice came through, older than she remembered. Rougher, but unmistakably him. Unmistakably alive when he was supposed to be dead from heart attack that Flynn had never believed was natural causes. Master Chief? Been watching the news. Seems you've been busy. Flynn's throat tightened. You're alive. They told me you died. Heart attack. 4 months after Syria. They told you wrong, or they told you what was convenient. I'm not dead, just very retired, very hidden, very interested in making sure certain people think I'm not around to testify about certain things. Where are you? Somewhere safe? Somewhere classified? Somewhere I can watch and wait and provide support when support is needed? Like now. Like tomorrow when you sit in front of people who will ask questions designed to trap you into admissions that serve them instead of truth. What do you need me to say? Need you to say exactly what happened. No embellishment, no protection of people who don't deserve protection. Tell them about Syria, about the ambush, about Torres running toward Ryan when everyone else ran away, about my decision to pull you out when you wanted to stay and die with your team, about the choice I made that saved you and destroyed your peace and gave you survivor's guilt that 2 years hasn't cured. Flynn felt tears building. First time in 2 years. First time since Syria when Hale dragged her away and she watched 5 people die because one person chose to live. I should have died there, she said, voice breaking. Should have stayed. Should have. You should have done exactly what you did. Followed orders. Trusted your commander. Survived when survival was the mission I gave you. You think I pulled you randomly? Think I chose you over them because you were special or lucky or anything except the operator I needed to survive so someone could finish what we started? Why me? Because you were the one who would care enough to spend 2 years hunting truth. Who would honor the philosophy I taught? Who would prove 0 necessary kills was possible when everyone else said it wasn't? Who would become the operator I trained you to be instead of the killer the system wanted you to become? Hale paused. She heard him breathing, heard the weight of years and decisions and the cost of command that came from making choices nobody should have to make. Tomorrow you testify, you tell them everything, you burn everyone involved, you accept that some people will hate you for it and some will call you hero, and most won't understand that you're neither. You're just operator who did job when job needed doing. That's enough. That's always been enough. Will I see you again? Maybe. When this settles, when the investigations conclude and the trials finish and the people who need punishing get punished. Maybe then, maybe not. But you'll know I'm watching. Know I'm proud. Know that pulling you out of Syria was the best decision I made in 33 years of making terrible decisions. The line went dead. Flynn sat holding the phone, feeling the weight of knowledge that Hale was alive, that the sacrifice she thought he made by dying early didn't happen, that he was somewhere safe watching and waiting and trusting her to finish what he started. She slept finally, dreamless sleep, the kind that came from exhaustion too deep for dreams to penetrate. Woke at dawn to messages from Vic and Brennan and dozen other people who needed coordination before testimony began. The federal building was everything Flynn expected, marble and flags and the architectural embodiment of institutional power that made individuals feel small and insignificant and reminded them that systems outlasted people and institutions mattered more than the individuals who comprised them. She entered through security that was thorough without being invasive. Metal detectors, ID verification. The screening that separated authorized from unauthorized and ensured only people with legitimate business entered spaces where legitimate business was conducted. The hearing room was arranged like courtroom without jury. Senators behind elevated bench. Witnesses at table below. Audience in gallery behind barrier that separated observers from participants. Everything designed to establish hierarchy and reinforce that power flowed downward from those who held it to those who requested it. Flynn sat at the witness table. Brennan beside her. Vic behind them in the gallery. 3 people who had spent 2 years seeking truth in systems designed to bury it. 3 people who had found it anyway through persistence that bordered on obsession and commitment that exceeded what regulations required. The chairman gavelled the hearing to order. Senator from Virginia, former Marine. The kind of politician who understood military culture because he had lived it before politics offered different path to different kind of power. Master Chief Flynn, Colonel Brennan, thank you for appearing today. Your testimony will help this committee understand failures in oversight that allowed weapons trafficking to occur and claims of betrayal that resulted in American casualties. Please raise your right hands. They were sworn, promised to tell truth, sat while lawyers whispered final instructions about what to say and what to avoid and how to navigate questions designed to elicit information that could be used against them if they answered carelessly. Flynn ignored the lawyers. She would tell truth, complete truth, the kind that lawyers worried about because truth was complicated and complexity created liability, and liability meant lawsuits and consequences that lawyers were paid to prevent. The chairman began. Master Chief Flynn, can you explain how a Marine officially declared KYA in Syria March 2019 is sitting before this committee in November 2021? Flynn leaned toward the microphone, spoke clearly, no hesitation, no qualification, just facts delivered with the certainty of someone who had nothing to hide because hiding accomplished nothing except delay. I survived the ambush that killed 5 other Marines. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Hale evacuated me despite my objections. My death was declared official to protect ongoing investigation into weapons trafficking that connected to the ambush. I spent 2 years operating under deep cover to identify the network responsible and gather evidence needed for prosecution. Who authorized your continued operations despite your official death status? That's classified above my clearance level. I received orders through encrypted channels. I executed those orders. Chain of command above me can answer questions about authorization. The chairman consulted notes. General Vega has invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and declined to testify. Captain Diaz similarly refused. We have evidence but not confessions. Can you provide testimony that establishes their guilt beyond documentation alone? Flynn pulled documents from her folder. The manifests, the transfer authorizations, the timeline that connected weapons movement to ambush timing to casualties that resulted. These documents show General Vega approved Javelin transfers to Syrian Democratic Forces. The Javelins never reached SDF. They were diverted to Taliban elements who used them 3 days later in ambush that killed Captain Ryan Brennan, Captain Luis Torres, and 4 others. The diversion required coordination from someone with access to shipping routes and logistics chains. That someone was Captain Diaz, who supervised Pentagon logistics for Syria Theater. Can you prove Diaz deliberately diverted the weapons rather than simply failed to prevent unauthorized diversion? Captain Luis Torres reported weapons discrepancies to Captain Diaz 2 weeks before the ambush. Torres suspected trafficking. Diaz was his commanding officer. Diaz had authority to investigate. Instead, Torres died in ambush that used the exact weapons he reported missing. That's not coincidence. That's murder disguised as combat casualty. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Cameras focused. Reporters typed. The machinery of exposure operating at speed that would ensure this testimony reached audiences who would demand accountability, or at least demand the appearance of accountability, which was sometimes all democracy could deliver. The questioning continued for 3 hours. Flynn answered everything. Brennan corroborated. Vic provided FBI perspective. Together, they built narrative that was complete and compelling and damning enough that committee members who had been skeptical at start were believers by end. The chairman gavelled adjournment. This committee thanks you for your testimony. We will recommend DOJ pursue prosecution with full resources. We will recommend DO review Syria operations for additional cases of betrayal. And we will recommend that Master Chief Flynn be restored to active duty with honors befitting her service and sacrifice. Flynn stood, walked out of the hearing room into hallway where media waited like predators sensing blood. Microphones thrust forward. Questions shouted. The chaos of journalists who had story and needed quotes and wanted sound bites that would make evening news and morning papers. She ignored them, pushed through, reached the exit where Brennan and Vic waited with vehicle that would take them away from attention and toward whatever came next in lives that had been derailed by Syria and were slowly finding rails again, even if the destination remained unclear. They drove to Arlington, to Hale's grave where Flynn needed to be, needed to stand and remember and acknowledge that the man who saved her was alive, but the cost of that salvation was 2 years of hiding and wondering and carrying weight that wasn't hers to carry, but that she carried anyway because survivors carry the memories of those who didn't survive. She knelt at the headstone, placed her hand on stone that was cold despite afternoon sun, spoke quietly to man who was alive somewhere listening, or maybe wasn't listening but would hear eventually, because truth had way of reaching people who needed to hear it, regardless of distance or time, or the barriers that separated living from hiding. Mission complete, Gunny. 6 honored. 0 necessary kills. Network exposed. Justice coming, even if it takes time. You taught me well. Taught me that competence creates options, and excellence creates options that don't exist until you make them exist. I made them exist. Hope that makes you proud. Brennan stood behind her, silent, respectful. The presence of someone who understood that some conversations were private even when conducted in public spaces. When Flynn stood, he spoke. What happens now for you? Don't know. Haven't thought past today. Past testimony and exposure and ensuring Vega and Diaz face consequences. After that, she shrugged. After that is unknown territory. You could come back to the coalition, could train the next generation, could teach them what Hale taught you. Maybe. Or maybe I stay in the shadows. Keep operating in spaces where I'm most effective. Keep doing what I do best, which is finding truth when systems hide it and delivering justice when courts can't. Vic approached. Her expression was thoughtful. FBI is offering you position, consultant, special operations liaison. Officially, you'd coordinate between bureau and military. Unofficially, you'd do exactly what you just described. Find truth, deliver justice. Operate in spaces where normal channels don't work. Flynn considered the offer. Considered the alternative, which was return to active duty and chain of command and the structure that had failed her in Syria and might fail her again if the same people who betrayed her then still held power now. Let me think about it. Give me week, month, however long it takes to process everything that happened and decide what comes next. Take the time you need. Offer stands whenever you're ready. They left Arlington as sunset and temperature dropped, and November reminded everyone that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. Flynn drove alone to a hotel where her gear waited, and her future remained uncertain, and the only thing she knew for certain was that the mission was complete. But the work was never finished because betrayal was constant, and fighting it required eternal vigilance. And the willingness to pay prices that comfort made people forget mattered. 6 months passed, trials proceeded, Vega was convicted, dishonorably discharged, sentenced to 20 years in military prison. Diaz cut deal, testified against 3 other officers involved in the network, received reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation that rolled up conspiracy that had operated for 5 years and killed dozens of operators who trusted chain of command that betrayed them. Flynn testified at each trial, answered questions, provided evidence, became face of exposure that media called heroic and military called complicated, and operators called necessary, even if it made everyone uncomfortable about how many similar betrayals might still be hidden. She accepted Vic's offer, became FBI consultant, worked cases that required her specific skills, the kind that involved deep cover and long operations, and the patience to build cases over months or years, instead of the quick arrests that made headlines but didn't dismantle networks. Brennan returned to Montana. The coalition continued, smaller now, more focused. The members who remained were the ones who understood that vigilance didn't mean paranoia, and preparation didn't mean extremism, and holding government accountable didn't require rejecting government entirely. Flynn visited him quarterly, coordination meetings officially, friendship actually, the bond that came from shared experience and shared mission, and the understanding that some people enter your life during crisis and stay, because crisis reveals character that normal times hide. On one visit, Brennan drove her to cemetery outside Bozeman where Ryan was buried. Small town cemetery, nothing like Arlington, just headstone and grass, and mountains beyond that looked the way Ryan probably remembered them from childhood before Marines in Syria and the ambush that ended his remembering. They stood at the grave, silent, the kind of silence that didn't need filling because understanding was complete and words would only diminish what silence conveyed. Finally, Brennan spoke. You gave me something I didn't have before. Peace. Not happiness, not closure, but peace. Understanding that Ryan died heroically instead of uselessly. That matters, more than I can express. He earned his death, Colonel. Luis, too. All 6 of them earned it by being exactly who they chose to be. That's all any of us can do. Choose who we are and live with consequences. Who are you, Master Chief, after everything? After Syria and Montana and Arlington and 6 months of trials and testimony, who did you choose to be? Flynn thought about the question, about Hale's lessons, about 0 necessary kills and competence, creating options and excellence, creating options that didn't exist until you made them exist. I'm operator who proves better way is possible, who shows that killing isn't always necessary when skill is sufficient, who honors the 6 by becoming the one they died believing I could be. They returned to Montana, to compound where new recruits trained and old members taught, and the coalition evolved into something that served purpose without becoming problem. Flynn spent week there, training, teaching, sharing lessons Hale taught her with people who would carry them forward and maybe teach others until the philosophy spread and 0 necessary kills became standard instead of exception. On her final day, she visited cemetery one last time, stood at headstone that held names she knew was false and body that wasn't actually buried there, and the comfortable lie that let Hale hide while she worked. Her phone buzzed. Text from number that appeared and disappeared and couldn't be traced because some communications existed outside systems designed to track them. New mission: Uzbekistan, arms trafficking. Suspected American involvement. 0 casualties required. Accept? Flynn stared at the message. Her mind drifted to the question she had been avoiding for 6 months. The question about what came next. About who she wanted to be instead of who the mission required her to be. She thought about alternatives. The life she could have if she chose it. Consultant work that didn't require deep cover. Teaching assignments where she could pass on Hale's philosophy without the operational risk. Maybe even something approaching normalcy. Relationships that lasted longer than mission timelines. A home that wasn't hotel room. Sleep that didn't come with weapon in reach. The life most people had, the life she had earned. But that life required choosing it. Required saying no to the mission and yes to something else. Required accepting that her debt to the Six was paid and she could move forward into different future. Flynn thought about Ryan running toward danger when everyone else ran away. About Luis choosing heroism over survival. About the 4 others whose names she carried like scars. About Hale pulling her out when she wanted to stay because he knew she was the one who would finish what they started. She thought about what Hale said, that she was the operator who would care enough to spend 2 years hunting truth. Who would prove 0 necessary kills was possible? Who would become what he trained her to be instead of what the system wanted? That operator didn't retire to normalcy. That operator kept going because going was what you did when the work mattered more than comfort, when the mission transcended personal preference, when the 6 who died believed in you enough to pay the price of your survival. Flynn understood now. The choice wasn't between mission and normal life. The choice was between honoring the 6 by continuing their work or dishonoring them by choosing ease over obligation. She typed response. Single word that contained everything about who she was and who she would remain and who the 6 who didn't survive had believed she could be. Always. The mission details arrived. She read them, memorized them, deleted them, prepared for deployment that would take her to places Americans couldn't find on maps to do work that would never be acknowledged to protect people who would never know they needed protecting. This was who she was. This was who she chose to be. Operator in shadows, hunter of truth, deliverer of justice when courts couldn't and systems wouldn't, and someone had to, because leaving betrayal unpunished meant betrayal continued and operators kept dying and families kept grieving, and nothing changed except the names on headstones and the dates they stopped mattering to everyone except people who remembered. Flynn packed out her gear, said goodbye to Brennan and the coalition and the life she might have chosen if choosing different life was option. But choosing required having options, and her options were determined by who she was, and who she was determined by the 6 who died and the 1 who survived, and the lessons learned in blood and sand, in the Montana wilderness, and Arlington's sacred ground. She drove toward airport, toward plane, toward Uzbekistan and whatever waited there, toward the next mission and the one after that and all the missions that would follow until missions ended, or she ended, or the world stopped needing people who operated in spaces between law and necessity. Her phone buzzed one final time. Message from Hale. Real one this time. No encryption, no codes, just words from teacher to student, from the one who saved her to the one who honored that salvation by becoming worth saving. 0 necessary, 6 honored, 1 teaching, mission continues. Proud of you, Master Chief, always have been, always will be. Go make them remember why competence matters more than credentials and excellence matters more than expedience. That's the legacy. That's what they died for. That's what you live for. Carry it forward. Flynn read the message, felt the weight of expectation and responsibility and the burden that came from being the one who survived. But she also felt the strength that came from knowing survival had purpose, that the 2 years since Syria hadn't been wasted, that the 6 who died hadn't died for nothing. She deleted the message, drove toward the future that waited, toward missions that would test whether 0 casualties was philosophy that survived beyond Syria and Montana and Arlington, whether it worked in Uzbekistan and wherever came after, whether the one who survived could keep proving that the ones who didn't survive had been right to believe in her. The answer was yes, had always been yes, would remain yes until yes became no and no meant ending. She wouldn't see coming because operators never saw their endings until endings arrived, and by then seeing didn't matter because the work was done or the work continued through others who carried it forward. Flynn intended to carry it forward. For Hale, for Ryan and Luis and the 4 others whose names were carved into her memory deeper than any headstone could carve. For the operators who would come after and need examples of what was possible when competence met commitment and excellence met necessity. For herself, because choosing who you were meant living with that choice, And she had chosen to be operator, who proved better way existed even when everyone said it didn't, who honored the dead by teaching the living, who made zero necessary kills the standard instead of the exception. That was the mission. That was the legacy. That was the only thing that mattered when everything else fell away and you stood alone with the weight of 6 graves and the responsibility of one survival and the understanding that living well was the only revenge against death that took people who deserved to live and left behind people who had to find reasons worth living for. Cara Flynn had found her reason, would carry it forward until carrying it forward became impossible, and someone else picked up the weight and continued the mission, because missions never ended. Even when operators did, and the work continued because the work was all that mattered, when you stripped away everything except the choice to serve and the commitment to honor that choice regardless of cost. She boarded the plane, settled into seat, closed her eyes, breathed the way Hale taught her, prepared the way training demanded, became the operator the 6 had believed she could be. 0 necessary, 6 honored, 1 teaching. Always. This story hit me differently than most. Flynn's 0 casualties rule isn't just tactics. It's a moral stand in a world where acceptable losses became acceptable lies. The hardest part, she trusted the chain of command until the chain of command sold her brothers out. Question for the veterans here. Have you ever had to choose between following orders and doing what's right? How do you honor the ones who didn't make it home when the system that sent them refuses accountability? Drop your thoughts below. And if this story resonated, there are more missions waiting in the playlist. Welcome to The Scope.